There are 122 vaults buried beneath the scorched earth of America. Built of reinforced concrete and Vault-Tec steel, they were supposed to be the cradles of a new civilization, places where the best and brightest of humanity would wait out the apocalypse before walking back into a freshened world. At least, that was the story. The brochures were beautiful. The Pip-Boys were handed out with a smile, and the people lined up, carrying their children and their most treasured belongings, trusting completely in a corporation that had spent decades telling them they would be safe. They were not safe. Tonight, we are going to open every one of those sealed doors. We are going to read the terminal entries left behind by people who never made it out. We are going to sit with the overseer logs, the desperate holotapes, the scratched-out diary entries on half-rotten paper. And somewhere in all of that darkness, you are going to find the rhythm of a world that had long since given up on its people, while its people refused to give up on each other. This is the story of 50 vault secrets, told slowly and in full, the way lore deserves to be told. So find somewhere comfortable. Let the sounds of the wasteland come in soft, and let the vault doors open one by one. Section 1. The Grand Deception. What the vaults were really for. The first thing you need to understand about Vault-Tec is that the company was never, at its core, in the business of saving lives. It was in the business of performing the largest controlled social experiment in the history of human civilization, financed partly by the United States government and directed, in its darker intentions, by the shadow organization known as the Enclave. This is not speculation. It is buried in the lore documents, in the Fallout Bible compiled by designer Chris Avellone, and in the words of Fallout's original creator Tim Kaine himself, who revealed in later interviews that the Vault program was always conceived as a kind of terrible joke. A joke with a punchline that nobody locked inside a vault ever got to hear. Here is the math that breaks the whole illusion. By the year 2077, the United States had a population of nearly 400 million people. Vault-Tec was commissioned to build 122 vaults. A standard vault, the size of Vault 13, could hold roughly 1,000 people. Do that arithmetic slowly and you arrive at a staggering truth. Even at full capacity, even if every single vault was packed beyond design specification, Vault-Tec could have sheltered, at most, somewhere in the neighborhood of 122,000 Americans. That is a fraction of a single percent of the population. The math never worked. The math was never supposed to work. The vaults were not built to save humanity. They were built to study it. Officially, the program was called Project Safehouse, a nationwide initiative to construct fallout shelters and preserve American civilization in the event of nuclear war. The public face of Project Safehouse was everything you would expect from a mid-century corporate optimism machine. Gleaming posters, cheerful Vault Boy mascots, family-friendly advertisements featuring smiling children boarding escalators into the earth while mushroom clouds bloomed in the painted distances behind them. Buy your Vault-Tec package now. Reserve your spot. Secure your future. Behind that glossy exterior sat an entirely different program, the Societal Preservation Program, and it was controlled by the Enclave. The Enclave, for those who have wandered the wasteland without knowing its full history, was the remnant of the pre-war United States government. Not the representative democracy that most Americans believed they lived in, but the shadow infrastructure beneath it. The black budget agencies, the military-industrial contractors, the cabinet officials who had long since concluded that a third world war was not a possibility, but a calendar event. They had watched the resource wars grind through decades of blood and oil. They had watched the United States and China creep toward a conflict that no diplomatic summit was ever going to prevent. And somewhere along the way, they had decided that rather than preventing the apocalypse, it was more useful to survive it. Their original plan was ambitious in the way that only the truly delusional can be. The Enclave wanted to build a multi-generational starship, not to evacuate millions of people, but to take a curated group of the best and the brightest by their own definition of those words and sail away from a dead Earth to colonize a new planet. The Vault experiments were designed to gather the data necessary to make that voyage possible. How did isolated communities behave over generations? What social structures emerged under extreme stress? How did genetic drift work in closed populations? What kind of leadership produced stable societies, and what kind collapsed into violence? The vaults were, in the coldest possible sense, a rehearsal for a journey that was never going to happen. The Enclave ran out of time and infrastructure. The bombs fell faster than expected. The Starship program was quietly shelved, and the Enclave retreated to its fortified platforms and oil rigs, while the experiments they had seeded across the country played themselves out without oversight, without purpose, without anyone left to read the data. 105 of the 122 vaults were experimental. Only 17 were genuine control vaults, shelters designed to function as advertised, places where people simply waited out the apocalypse before emerging to help rebuild. 17 out of 122. The remaining 105 were constructed with deliberate flaws, cruel conditions, psychological provocations, biological dangers, and social manipulations baked into their architecture from the very first poured foundation. The people who entered these vaults were not colonists or survivors. They were test subjects, selected in advance, their personalities and demographics curated to match the specific parameters of each experiment. The overseers who ran them were, in most cases, complicit. Many had been told the truth about their vault's purpose before the door ever closed. Most of them sealed themselves in anyway. This is the foundational secret of the entire Fallout universe. Everything you encounter in the wasteland, every ghoul city and super mutant settlement and paranoid survivalist community, traces its roots back to this singular act of institutional betrayal. A corporation, backed by a government, decided that its citizens were more valuable as data points than as people. The second secret, nested inside the first, is that many of the experiments were not even particularly useful. Some of them were absurd. A few were almost comically cruel. The Fallout Bible, compiled from internal documents and developer notes that span the original Black Isle games, contains descriptions of vault conditions that read less like scientific methodology and more like the diary of someone with very limited empathy and a great deal of institutional power. Vault 55, for example, had all of its entertainment tapes removed. No films, no recordings, no music, no diversions of any kind. Just people and silence and the hum of recirculated air. Vault 56 was the controlled counterpart. It had entertainment tapes, but only a single one, featuring a comedian described in the source documents as a particularly bad comic actor. Sociologists working with Vault-Tec predicted that the inhabitants of Vault 55, deprived of all distraction, would collapse first. Their prediction turned out to be incorrect. The people of Vault 56, subjected to the same terrible performance on loop for years, deteriorated faster. Apparently, there is something uniquely maddening about having something and wishing you had nothing. The fate of both vaults is officially unknown. The experiment was designed, the vaults were sealed, and nobody left behind a sufficient record to tell us how either story ended. Two groups of human beings descended into concrete bunkers and vanished into the silence of the lore. Then there is Vault 92, built specifically to house the world's greatest musicians, which we will return to in much greater detail. And Vault 112, designed around a single man's desire for a personalized toy box, which also deserves its own extended meditation. And the terrible symmetry of Vaults 68 and 69, which were counterparts of each other in an experiment so blunt in its human cost that the Fallout Bible describes Vault 69 only with the word interesting and nothing more. All of these came from the same source, a company and a government that believed the people who trusted them were resources to be managed rather than lives to be protected. The third secret, the quietest one, is this. Even the control vaults, the 17 supposedly safe shelters, were not entirely clean. Vault 76, presented throughout Fallout 76 as the pristine control vault, the place where only America's best and brightest were invited, was still a selected population. Still a curated demographic, still monitored. The control was not freedom from the experiment. It was simply a different kind of observation, one where the variables were limited rather than deliberately manipulated. The people in Vault 76 were still being watched. They just had better food. There is something quietly devastating about that. The lucky ones, the ones who got the honest vault, the one that actually opened its doors on time and sent them back into a world that was beginning to heal, were still, at the end of it, subjects of a program that had traded their trust for data. They just happened to be the dataset that was treated decently. The other 105 were not so fortunate. If you are watching this from somewhere in the world tonight, drop your location and time in the comments. There is something comforting about knowing people are listening from everywhere at once, from cities and towns and quiet rooms on opposite ends of the planet. And if you have not subscribed yet, now would be a gentle moment to do it. More of these are coming, and some of them are even darker than this one. Section 2. The Radiation Experiments Vaults, built to kill slowly. Of all the vault experiments, the ones involving deliberate radiation exposure have a particular quality to them. They are not the most elaborate. They are not the most psychologically sophisticated. They are, in a way, the most honest about what Vault-Tec was willing to do. Take people who came to them for shelter and simply expose them to the thing they were fleeing. Vault 12 sits at the center of this category, and it is worth spending real time with it because its history is one of the most fully realized in the entire Fallout universe. The vault is located beneath the ruins of Bakersfield, California, a town that eventually transforms itself into a place called Necropolis after enough of its ghoulified population survives long enough to form a community. That detail alone is worth pausing on. The survivors of Vault 12's deliberate contamination did not simply die. Many of them lived, transformed into ghouls by prolonged radiation exposure, and built a city. They named it after death, because what else would you name a place founded on the knowledge that you had been sacrificed by the people who promised to save you? The design of Vault 12 was elegant in its simplicity. The brochure was beautiful. The water filtration system was described in promotional materials as the finest ever installed in any Vault-Tec facility. It boasted every amenity. The application process was rigorous and competitive, which made the people who were selected feel chosen, special, worthy of survival in a way that their neighbors might not be. When the bombs began to fall over California and the panicked citizens of Bakersfield made their way to the vault entrance, they carried with them the reasonable confidence that they had made the right decision, that they had been smart and prepared, that their children would be safe. The vault door had been engineered not to close. It was not a malfunction. The specifications for Vault 12's design included a deliberate flaw in the door mechanism, something that looked functional to casual inspection, something that might plausibly be explained as an accident when the radiation came pouring in through the gap. The experiment was straightforward. Observe the long-term effects of nuclear radiation on a sealed human population. Study the progression of ghoulification. Document how communities adapt, or fail to adapt, to the biological transformation that follows sustained exposure to the kinds of radiation released by thermonuclear weapons. The results were exactly what any honest scientist would have predicted. People died. Others developed radiation sickness in its most acute forms: the hair loss, the cellular breakdown, the slow and agonizing failure of systems that the human body had never evolved to defend against. And some, a smaller number, survived that first terrible wave of exposure and found themselves changed. Their skin hardened and grayed. Their eyes changed. The normal rhythms of aging slowed almost to a stop. They had become ghouls. The ghouls of Vault 12 lived with the knowledge of what had been done to them for 2 centuries before the events of the original Fallout game. They built Necropolis in the ruins above their contaminated vault, a city of the irradiated and the unwanted, governed in part by a figure called the Master Super Mutant and inhabited by beings who remembered, in whatever way the long irradiated mind can remember, what it meant to be human. There is an entire library worth of grief buried in that city. Vault 6 was Vault 12's quieter cousin, a vault built with a mechanism that allowed a small, controlled amount of radiation to seep in every day. Not enough to kill quickly, just enough to ensure that the population was constantly, gradually being exposed, the dose low enough that the effects would take years to manifest fully. The experiment appears to have been designed to test whether a community could maintain itself and its social structures even as its members slowly transformed into something other than what they had been. Whether the ghoulification process could be normalized, incorporated into a community's identity, made into something a group of people could live with rather than flee from, the records are incomplete. What we know is that Vault 6 exists somewhere in the lore, that it shared its experimental parameters with Vault 12, and that the slow-burn nature of its contamination made it a different kind of horror. Not the sudden shock of a broken door, but the creeping awareness, arrived at over years and decades, that the air you had been breathing every single day of your life in the vault was quietly remaking you. There is something about that particular kind of betrayal that settles into the bones in a different way. It is not the dramatic violence of a door that refuses to seal. It is the realization, slow as the radiation itself, that you were never safe, that the safety was always a story, that the story was told specifically to keep you calm while the experiment ran its course. The Enclave's interest in radiation experiments was not purely academic, of course. The organization had spent decades preparing for a post-nuclear world, and a significant part of that preparation involved understanding what radiation did to human biology over time. If they were going to rebuild civilization, or more accurately curate a version of it, they needed to know whether the irradiated masses of the wasteland were recoverable, whether their genetic material was viable, whether the FEV exposed and the ghoulified and the mutation-carrying survivors were the raw material for a new humanity, or simply noise to be cleared away. The radiation vaults gave them that data. The people inside them gave their lives for research they never agreed to conduct. What makes Vault 12 particularly significant in the larger mythology is that its long-term consequences became visible in ways that most experiments never did. Necropolis was not just a city. It was evidence. It was a monument to what Vault-Tec had done, written in concrete and ghoul flesh above the hole in the ground where the door never closed. Every traveler who passed through those ruins was walking through the aftermath of a deliberate act, even if they did not know it. Even if the story had been so thoroughly buried by the chaos of 200 years that most people in the wasteland had no idea the city had ever been anything other than exactly what it appeared. A place where the radiation people were left to be. The original Fallout game gives players the chance to encounter Necropolis. The ghouls there are not simply enemies. Some of them remember. Some of them are angry in a way that goes deeper than survival instinct. A slow burn of knowing directed at a world that decided they were expendable and built a story to cover it. That anger is one of the most honest, emotional through lines in the entire series. It does not require explanation. It only requires that you sit with it for a moment. Section 3. Chemical warfare from within the drug and white noise experiments. If the radiation experiments represent Vault-Tec's most direct form of cruelty, the chemical experiments represent something more unsettling. A cruelty that required the victims to experience themselves changing from the inside. The distinction matters because it adds a layer of psychological horror that the radiation experiments, for all their physical devastation, do not quite reach. To be irradiated is terrible. To have your own mind turned against you by something invisible in the air is a different kind of loss. Vault 106 was sealed on the 23rd of October 2077, the same date every vault was sealed. The date the bombs fell and the world outside became exactly what Vault-Tec had been telling people it would become. The people who entered Vault 106 were not selected for any particular quality. Their demographics, as far as the existing records suggest, were fairly typical. A cross-section of pre-war Americans who had secured their spots through the standard application process, paid their fees, completed their intake paperwork. They brought their families and their hope and descended into the earth. 10 days after the vault was sealed, an order came from Vault-Tec's Oversight Committee. The vault's air filtration system was to be modified. Psychoactive drugs, the specific compounds undisclosed in most of the surviving documentation, were to be introduced into the recirculated atmosphere at concentrations sufficient to produce measurable behavioral effects. The experiment was designed to test what happened to a closed community when its cognition was chemically altered without its knowledge or consent. The overseer of Vault 106 knew. The terminal entries recovered from the vault suggest a person who was troubled by the knowledge but followed the protocol regardless. There is a particular kind of institutional obedience captured in those entries, the voice of someone who had convinced themselves that the experiment was being conducted by people with better information than they had, that there was a reason, that the reason was sufficient. It is the voice of someone who had stopped asking questions and was trying very hard not to start again. What the drugs did to the population of Vault 106 was not uniform. That is one of the things the recovered records make clear. The response was varied, idiosyncratic, shaped by the individual biochemistry and psychology of each person exposed. Some inhabitants fell into a kind of prolonged calm, a muted, floating state that the logs describe with clinical neutrality as reduced agitation. Others became paranoid. Some developed what the records call accelerated aggression. The social structure of the vault began to fray as the months passed. As the chemical exposure accumulated, as the line between who was responding to the drugs and who was responding to their neighbors' responses to the drugs became impossible to draw. By the time things came fully apart, Vault 106 had become the kind of place that does not leave many survivors. The psychotic eventually turned on the calm. The calm turned on the paranoid. The paranoid turned on everyone. The researchers documented this from behind the locked door of the overseer's office for as long as they could. Then the documentation stopped, which is itself a kind of data point. By the time players encounter Vault 106 inches Fallout 3, the vault has been abandoned for over a century. But it is not empty. The few remaining survivors, long-term descendants of people who were exposed from birth and across generations, have adapted to the drugs in the air in a way that might be called survival and might be called something else entirely. They are hostile. They are chemically altered. And the air in that vault, even 200 years later, still carries traces of the original compounds. Walking through Vault 106 inches the game is one of the few times the wasteland directly affects the player character's cognition, causing hallucinations that blur the line between what is real in the environment and what the drugs are constructing. That design choice, making the player experience a fraction of what the vault's original inhabitants experienced, is one of Fallout 3's quieter moments of craft. It does not explain the horror. It asks you to briefly inhabit it. Vault 95, encountered in Fallout 4, ran a variation on the chemical manipulation theme that is, in some ways, even darker than Vault 106's approach because it was so much more patient about it. Vault 95 was designed specifically to house people with chemical addictions. This was not a coincidence of demographic selection. It was the explicit purpose. Vault-Tec, working with its enclave connections, recruited people who were dependent on chems, the umbrella term for the various stimulants, narcotics, and performance-altering substances that had become embedded in pre-war American life. These were not criminals or social outcasts necessarily. Chem dependency in the Fallout universe was widespread and largely normalized, the product of a society that had spent decades in the shadow of inevitable conflict and had developed pharmaceutical coping mechanisms accordingly. The people who entered Vault 95 were told they would receive rehabilitation, that the vault had been specifically equipped for their recovery, that among the survivors of the apocalypse, they would be given the tools and the support to overcome their dependencies and emerge, years later, clean and capable and ready to contribute to the reconstruction of civilization. For the first 5 years, the program worked. Terminal entries from that period described genuine progress, people completing withdrawal, rebuilding relationships, developing skills, finding purpose in the communal life of the vault. There are notes from counselors that read like genuine investment, like people who believed in what they were doing and in the capacity of their patients to change. 5 years is a long time in a small, enclosed community. By that point, many of the residents had built real lives, genuine connections, real reasons to want the recovery to hold. Then a Vault-Tec operative who had been living among them the whole time, posing as a fellow resident, opened a cache of chems that had been hidden in the vault's walls since before the door ever closed. The cache was substantial, enough for everyone, and its sudden appearance was not accidental. It was the experiment commencing. The rehabilitation period had been the setup. The true study was what happened when people in recovery, people who had worked genuinely hard to rebuild their lives around sobriety, were suddenly given access to the thing they had spent 5 years fighting. What would they do? Would the bonds they had built hold? Would the social structures of the vault protect the most vulnerable members, or would individual craving overwhelm collective care? The answer was documented in full. The records from the period immediately following the cache's discovery are among the more harrowing pieces of writing in the Fallout series. There is one entry, a single page from someone who understood exactly what was happening, who had recognized the Vault-Tec operative for what they were, who had found the false bottom in a storage unit weeks before the cache was revealed. That person had documented their outrage with a clarity that makes it one of the most human pieces of the entire lore, and they did not survive to see the end. Within weeks of the cache being opened, Vault 95 collapsed into violence. Old dependencies resurfaced. New ones formed. The rehabilitation program that had been 5 years in the building was destroyed in days. By the time players encounter Vault 95 Inches Fallout 4, its corridors are occupied by gunners, a mercenary faction, and the only traces of its original inhabitants are the terminal entries and the occasional personal effect left behind in a room where someone once tried very hard to get better. And then there is Vault 92, which deserves its own extended treatment because it combined chemical manipulation with a specific demographic choice that elevates it, in certain lights, from mere cruelty to something that reads almost like a particular kind of artistic statement. Vault 92 was built to house the world's greatest musicians. This was the pitch, and it was persuasive. In the years leading up to the Great War, Vault-Tec began reaching out through intermediaries to the most accomplished musicians in the United States: concert pianists, composers, virtuoso string players, jazz improvisationists, recording artists whose work had defined the sonic landscape of pre-war America. They were told that Vault 92 had been designed specifically to preserve musical culture, to ensure that the art of music would survive the apocalypse intact, that in a world where everything else might be lost, the vault would maintain the instruments and the talent and the technical knowledge to carry music into the next civilization. For people who had devoted their lives to something as intangible and conditional as musical excellence, this was an extraordinary offer. It was also, for many of them, the only vault spot available. The waiting lists for standard vaults were impossibly long by 2077. Vault 92's targeted recruitment gave musicians an option, a lifeline, a path to survival that came with the added meaning of being told that their specific gift was the reason they were being saved. They brought their instruments. Some of them brought students or partners or family members who also qualified. They descended into a vault that had indeed been outfitted with recording equipment and practice spaces and every amenity that a serious musician could ask for. For those first hours and days after the door sealed, it must have seemed, against all rational expectation, like the right choice had been made. The overseer of Vault 92 was a man named Richard Rubin, and from the moment the vault sealed, Rubin began implementing a classified Vault-Tec program called the White Noise Mind Suggestion Combat Experimentation Protocol, designated internally as WNMSCE. The experiment was built on research into subliminal messaging through the manipulation of ultra-low-frequency white noise embedded in sound. The vaults were full of sound. Air filtration systems and recyclers created a constant ambient noise floor, and Vault 92 had been built with an enhanced sound infrastructure specifically for the musicians. What those musicians did not know was that the speakers they used, the recording systems they worked with, the ambient audio environment they inhabited every hour of every day had been modified to carry white noise overlaid with frequencies that could not be consciously perceived, but could, the research suggested, plant suggestions in the subconscious mind. Rubin began with isolated tests, individual sessions in soundproof recording studios where the white noise was layered into the playback system. The initial results were modest. A musician leaving a session would feel slightly off, slightly agitated, unable to articulate the source. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would cause alarm. The overseer logged these results with evident satisfaction. Over time, Rubin extended the white noise to the vault's main speakers. He prohibited personal headphones and portable sound devices to ensure maximum exposure. A colleague, Professor John Malleus, who was aware of some aspects of the experiment, documented early results showing that around a third of the vault's population was entering trance-like states during certain sound frequencies and showing minor behavioral tics consistent with successful suggestion. Implantation. Rubin read these results and expanded the program. What happened next was not particularly surprising in hindsight, which makes the overseer's apparent shock at the outcome genuinely puzzling. A community of deeply sensitive, highly attuned people who had trained their ears to detect the subtlest variations in sound, people whose entire professional identity was built on listening, was being subjected to subliminal audio manipulation in an enclosed space with no escape. The sensitivity that made them exceptional musicians also made them exceptionally vulnerable to the specific intervention being applied. The white noise grew louder. The suggestions became more aggressive. Approximately 30% of the vault's population began exhibiting what the official documents call neurological degradation, manifesting as dramatically elevated aggression and increasingly erratic behavior. Another portion remained more or less stable. but they were living alongside people whose cognition was being systematically dismantled in a vault from which there was no exit. By Professor Malleus's own later accounting, some 35 residents had died, and close to 70 others were displaying symptoms consistent with clinical insanity by the point. He attempted to report the situation to the overseer. Rubin, at this stage, had apparently lost his grip on the experiment as a controlled process. The records suggest someone who had convinced himself the data was still valuable, even as the vault collapsed around him. The command phrase that Rubin had been using to bring affected individuals out of their violent episodes had stopped working. The suggestion system was no longer producing predictable outputs. The musicians of Vault 92, the people whose talent had been the stated justification for their survival, had been driven past any reliable point of manipulation. Most of them did not make it out. By the time a player reaches Vault 92 inches Fallout 3, the corridors are host to bloatflies and mirelurks that have taken up residence in the long-abandoned space. The recording equipment is still there. The instruments are still there. In one room, there is a piano. The wood has warped. The strings have gone slack. And somewhere in the files of the overseer's office terminal, buried under the bureaucratic language of a program that destroyed the very people it claimed to cherish, is the record of what was done to the world's greatest musicians in the name of research that no one was ever coming back to collect. Section 4. The Biology of Horror, Genetic and Biological Experiments. The genetic experiments run by Vault-Tec represent the program at its most scientifically ambitious, which is another way of saying the most methodically dehumanizing. Where the chemical experiments used invisible agents in the air to alter the minds of their subjects, the biological experiments treated the people inside as raw material, genetic libraries to be sorted, optimized, and discarded according to criteria that the subjects never saw and would not have agreed to. Vault 87 is the place where this tendency reached its most extreme expression, and it is, in the broader history of the wasteland, one of the most consequential vaults ever built because the monsters it created did not stay contained. The records for Vault 87 are incomplete in a way that suggests deliberate obfuscation. The original social experiment for which the vault was ostensibly designed, whatever that experiment was, appears to have been scrapped before the vault was ever fully operational. What replaced it was a program run under the authority of the Evolutionary Experimentation Program, a classified Vault-Tec initiative that had been quietly developing strains of a substance called the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV. FEV deserves some context. The virus had been developed in the years before the war as part of a military research program, an attempt to create soldiers capable of surviving the biological and chemical agents that would inevitably be used in a full-scale nuclear conflict. The theoretical endpoint was a human being with dramatically enhanced physical strength, resistance to radiation and disease, and a biological resilience that went far beyond anything natural selection had produced. The practical results of the research were more complicated and considerably more disturbing. When introduced to a human subject, FEV did not simply enhance, it transformed. The virus rewrote cellular structure at a fundamental level, accelerating certain biological processes while eliminating others entirely. Subjects lost the capacity for sexual reproduction, shifting from a gendered biological identity to something that the research classified as asexual. Muscle density and bone density increased dramatically. The brain, contrary to the hopes of whoever had designed the program, did not reliably maintain its original cognitive function. In many subjects, the transformation produced not a super soldier capable of complex thought and strategic decision-making, but something much more fundamental. A creature of enormous physical power and sharply reduced intellectual capacity, aggressive almost by default, uncontrollable by design. In Vault 87, which was located in the capital wasteland region near what had been Washington, D.C., the Evolutionary Experimentation Program took the residents of the vault into airtight chambers and exposed them to concentrated doses of an FEV variant. This was not a gradual process, not the slow creep of a modified air supply or a 10-day delay before the drug started flowing. The exposure at Vault 87 was direct and deliberate and fast. Those who survived the initial exposure changed. The men in particular developed the characteristic physical profile that any Fallout player recognizes immediately. Enormous height, massive muscular development, green-gray skin, and a cognitive simplicity that expressed itself most readily as violence. They had become the super mutants of the capital wasteland, and when the vault eventually became too unstable to contain them, they escaped into the ruins of Washington and began doing what FEV had made them: searching, recruiting, transforming others. This is the vault whose experiment became a defining feature of an entire regional ecology. Every super mutant patrol that stalks the ruins of the old capital, every green hulk standing guard over a shattered monument or a collapsed federal building, traces its biological origin to a vault where human beings were locked into chambers and fundamentally rewritten at a molecular level. The scale of what Vault 87 unleashed is almost impossible to fully reckon with. 200 years after the experiment began, its products are still wandering the wasteland in enormous numbers, a permanent feature of the landscape that serves as an ongoing, living consequence of what Vault-Tec was willing to do. Vault 22, located in the Mojave Desert in the region explored by Fallout, New Vegas, approached the biological transformation question from a different direction. Rather than modifying the humans, Vault 22 scientists attempted to modify the plants. The stated purpose of Vault 22 was agricultural research. It had been populated with scientists, botanists, and researchers whose expertise lay in plant biology and sustainable food production, people who were working on the genuinely important problem of how to maintain food security in a post-war world where traditional agriculture might be impossible for generations. The vault had been equipped with extensive laboratory space and growth chambers, and the research conducted there in the early years was, by the standards of Vault-Tec's program, relatively benign, developing plants that could thrive in low-light conditions, that could be grown in the controlled environment of an underground facility, that could maintain adequate nutritional content without access to natural sunlight or soil. One of the projects involved a fungus, intended as a biological agent for pest control. Fungal applications in agriculture were not unusual even in the pre-war world, and the specific strain being developed at Vault 22 was designed to target common vault pests, the kinds of insects and microorganisms that could devastate a closed-cycle agricultural system if allowed to establish themselves. It seemed practical. It seemed useful. It seemed like the kind of research that had a clear positive application. The fungal spores proved to be viable in human hosts. The timeline of what happened in Vault 22 after this discovery was identified in the research logs is compressed and terrible. The spores, released during what appears to have been a containment failure in one of the laboratory sections, began spreading through the vault's circulation system. Unlike the targeted pest applications the researchers had designed them for, the spores were not selective. They found the human body a hospitable environment, and the incubation period, somewhere between 10 and 20 days according to the recovered records, gave them ample opportunity to spread before any host began showing symptoms. The symptoms, when they arrived, were not subtle. The fungal infection transformed its hosts from within, growing through tissue and organ, taking over the body's motor systems while the original consciousness of the host apparently remained, at least initially, present and aware. What the data recovered from Vault 22 describes is a population that became, over a matter of weeks, something that was neither plant nor person, mobile, aggressive, driven by whatever biological imperatives the fungus had overlaid on the host's original psychology. 118 people survived long enough to flee the vault. The records describe what they became as they moved through the Mojave: cannibalistic, driven by something that was no longer recognizable as the personality or values of the person who had entered the vault. They attacked other survivors. They were avoided and feared. The vault they had left behind, its corridors now thick with plant growth, became one of the most visually arresting locations in Fallout, New Vegas, a place where the plants had won so thoroughly that the human architecture was nearly invisible beneath the green. There is still, in the deepest parts of Vault 22, a terminal entry written by the researcher who first identified the spore viability in human tissue. It is a short entry. The tone is clinical in the way that people sometimes become clinical when the horror of what they are documenting has exceeded the available emotional vocabulary. The entry ends with a sentence that does not quite complete itself. The person who wrote it was presumably already beginning to change by the time they stopped typing. Vault 75, encountered in Fallout 4, represents perhaps the most morally indefensible of all the genetic experiments because its subjects were children. The vault was built beneath Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth region that would eventually become the setting of Fallout 4. The selection process for Vault 75 was built around the school itself. Families with children enrolled at Malden Middle were identified as priority candidates for vault placement. This was framed as a humanitarian provision, ensuring that the community around the school would have access to shelter. When the bombs fell and the families of Malden Middle's students made their way to the vault entrance, they were bringing their children, as parents do, because they believed that the vault was the safest place for them. The adults were separated from the children immediately upon entry, escorted to a staging area that was described to them as an orientation session. There was no orientation. Vault-Tec security personnel executed the adults in that room. All of them. Every parent, every teacher, every adult who had trusted the system enough to bring their child to the shelter point. The children were then escorted to the atrium, where they were greeted warmly and told that they would be cared for and educated, that they would learn to be strong and capable, that one day they would be the ones who walked back out into the world and helped rebuild it. The world outside was given a name, Uptopland. The children were taught that Uptopland was terrifying, that only the most capable and resilient of them would ever be ready to face it. This was not an accident of framing. It was a deliberate element of the experimental design, creating a psychological profile of existential threat tied to the outside world, ensuring that the children would remain compliant and motivated to improve themselves without questioning why improvement was being demanded of them. The testing was continuous and comprehensive. Physical fitness, cognitive function, emotional regulation, pain tolerance, stress response, everything was measured, logged, analyzed. The researchers who ran Vault 75 were looking for the genetic expression of certain traits, the biological signals of what they considered optimal human qualities, and they were looking for them across a developmental timeline. Children were assessed at intake and reassessed at regular intervals as they grew. At age 18, each resident of Vault 75 received their graduation. This word was not used ironically. The records maintain a tone of cheerful institutional optimism throughout, which makes them considerably more disturbing than records that acknowledged what they were doing. At graduation, those judged to be exceptional, the most physically and cognitively gifted, were harvested. A euphemism, the documentation does not attempt to clarify beyond noting that genetic material was extracted for use in developing embryos for future generations of superior children. Those judged useful but not exceptional were offered positions on the science team, where they would continue working within the experimental framework. Those judged to have insufficient genetic value were killed. The Vault's program ran for multiple generations before a revolt ended it. One of the recently graduated scientists who had been recruited into the research team used their new access to organize the remaining residents. The records of the revolt are incomplete, ending abruptly in a way that suggests the terminal they were being written on was destroyed in the fighting. What is clear is that the revolt succeeded in the limited sense that the program ended. What happened to the survivors is not documented. By the time Fallout 4 players discover Vault 75, the Gunner faction has claimed the space. The combat training facilities that Vault-Tec built to develop its child super soldiers are still functional. And in the administrative areas, behind security doors that require key cards to open, the full record of the experiment still sits in the terminals, waiting to be read by anyone who goes looking. Section 5. The Psychology of Cruelty Social Experiments Designed to Break People. The social experiments are, in certain ways, the most philosophically interesting category of Vault experiment, because they asked a question that Vault-Tec's more biologically minded researchers never quite got to. What does institutional pressure do to the way people treat each other? How much cruelty will a community accept and perpetuate when the cruelty is built into the rules of the game they are playing? What happens when you take ordinary people and construct a social environment specifically designed to make them harm one another? Vault 11, located in the Mojave Desert, was honest with its residents in a way that was somehow worse than deception. When the vault was sealed, its inhabitants were informed directly that a sacrifice would be required. One vault resident must be offered up each year. If the population refused to make the sacrifice, the vault's computer system would execute everyone. This was stated plainly, at the outset, without metaphor or softening language. What the vault's designers wanted to observe was how a community organized itself around an unavoidable, institutionalized requirement for human sacrifice. How would the selection process work? Would the community develop formal mechanisms? Would informal power structures emerge to protect some residents while exposing others? What happened to a democracy when the democratic process was turned toward the selection of a victim? The people of Vault 11 decided, in the aftermath of the initial shock, that the fairest possible approach was to hold elections. The overseer would be chosen democratically, would serve a term, and would be sacrificed at the term's end. The logic had a certain grim internal consistency. If someone had to die, it might as well be the person with the most power, and the power of the position would motivate candidates, meaning the sacrifice would always come from the ranks of the ambitious. For the first several years, this arrangement held. People ran for the overseer position knowing what the outcome would be. Their motivations were presumably complex, a genuine belief in their own capacity to lead, a sense of duty, perhaps a kind of fatalism shaped by the closed-system logic of the vault. The terminal entries from this period include the words of overseers who accepted their role with something that reads, in the terse shorthand of bureaucratic documentation, like dignity. Then the corruption set in, as corruption tends to do in small communities with high stakes and closed exits. The overseer position began to be used as a weapon by faction leaders. Political opponents were nominated against their will, threatened with violence if they refused to run or refused to accept election. The process of selecting a sacrifice became entangled with every existing grievance, every personal rivalry, every economic and social tension within the vault. People were coerced into the ballot box. Votes were bought and threatened. The democratic fiction stretched until it tore, and when it tore, the vault's governing council reverted to the vault computer, making selections at random. The random selection system turned out to be no more tolerable. The combination of arbitrariness and inevitability produced a psychological atmosphere that the recovered records describe in terms that suggest a community in a state of permanent low-grade catastrophe. Everyone at risk, no one safe? The annual sacrifice, not a tragedy, but a recurring feature of institutional life that everyone had learned to live around and through. Vault 11's full experiment ran for what the records suggest was approximately 16 years. The mechanism that eventually ended it, had the community only known, had been built into the Vault system from the beginning. The people of Vault 11 were never required to sacrifice anyone. If they had simply refused, from the very first year, to offer up any resident, the computer would have rewarded their commitment to human life with a congratulatory message and unlocked the vault door. The vault designers had built in a moral test, and the test was whether the community would discover, through refusal, that the demand was a bluff. They never discovered it. Not in 16 years. Not because they were not intelligent or not moral, but because the structure of the situation, the closed space, the institutional authority of the announcement, the lack of any precedent for defiance, made refusal feel like an option that the architecture of the vault had simply not included. When the remaining residents of Vault 11 eventually find a way to shut down the sacrificial system, the computer's final announcement confirms that the alternative was always available. The records indicate that the 5 people still alive in the vault at that point responded to this information in the way you might expect people to respond after 16 years of unnecessary sacrifice, with a despair that had nowhere to go. Vault 19, in the Mojave, ran a psychological experiment that was, in some ways, more refined than Vault 11's blunt institutional demand for sacrifice. Vault 19 was designed to test whether paranoia could be induced in a community through non-chemical, non-violent means, through atmosphere, suggestion, and division. The vault's population was divided into 2 separate sections, red and blue, each with its own living spaces, its own overseer, and its own limited contact with the other. The physical separation was maintained carefully, and the design of the vault made it visually apparent. Red sector, blue sector, a clear demarcation built into the architecture of the space. This was not incidental. The color coding was deliberate, a visual cue that was intended to make the psychological reality of division feel structural and permanent. Into this divided community, the vault's operators introduced a carefully calibrated program of environmental gaslighting. Strange noises with no apparent source. Drafts from ventilation systems at hours when drafts were unexpected. lights that flickered in patterns that were almost, but not quite, too regular to be equipment malfunction. The smell of something faintly wrong in the air above the beds. Shadows at the periphery of corridors that resolved into nothing when approached. None of these effects were dramatic. None of them were individually conclusive. Each one could be explained, dismissed, rationalized as equipment aging, as the ordinary sensory noise of an enclosed mechanical space. But accumulate enough small, unexplained things in a divided community where the two halves already view each other with the slight suspicion that physical separation tends to produce, and something begins to happen. The unexplained things do not remain unexplained. They get explained through the easiest cognitive mechanism available: blame. The other sector must be responsible. The strange noises must be coming from their side. The smells and the ventilation must be something they are putting in. The lights must be a signal, a code, a message intended for someone the red sector or the blue sector was not supposed to know about. What happened beneath all of this psychological stagecraft in Vault 19 was compounded by a coincidence of geography. The vault had been built above a system of sulfur caves, and the sulfur that began to seep through the ventilation system after some years of operation produced genuine physiological symptoms, headaches and cognitive disruption, and a persistent sense of wrongness that was entirely real and entirely unrelated to any action by either faction. The sulfur, in other words, vindicated the paranoia. The strange smells were real, the cognitive fog was real, and by the time the actual environmental cause was identifiable, the community had already constructed elaborate social narratives to explain the symptoms in terms of the other side's malice. Vault 19's population eventually abandoned the vault, which is why the powder gangers found it empty when they moved in during the events of New Vegas. The sulfur levels in the caves below had made the lower sections uninhabitable, and the social structure had deteriorated to the point where coordinated action to address the problem was no longer possible. The vault that had been designed to study the creation of paranoia had, in the end, been finished off by a genuine environmental hazard that nobody had thought to plan for: the sulfur that had nothing to do with the experiment and everything to do with where someone had decided to build a vault. There is a certain poetry in that. Vault 101 from Fallout 3 sits somewhat apart from the other social experiments because its cruelty was quieter and its subject matter was closer to the game's own narrative. The vault was designed around a single premise: never open. Most vaults, even the experimental ones, were eventually intended to release their populations. The overseer would receive an all-clear signal, the door would open, and the residents would emerge into whatever the wasteland had become. Vault 101 had no such signal scheduled. The door was never supposed to open, ever. The vault had been stocked with equipment designed for indefinite operation: parts for the water processor, extended food production capacity, everything needed to sustain a population for as long as the facility could hold together. The stated experiment was the study of prolonged isolation, the investigation of what happened to a community that had no endpoint, no horizon, no eventual emergence to give meaning to the endurance. But the true experiment, known only to the overseer and a select few, was even more specific than that. It was the study of the overseer's role itself. In a vault that never opened, that had no formal connection to the outside world, the overseer's authority was absolute and indefinitely sustained. There was no external check, no oversight committee, no periodic review. The overseer was the law, the source of all institutional legitimacy, the single point of contact between the vault's residents and whatever decisions governed their lives. Vault 101 was, in essence, a study of what permanent, unchecked authority did to the person who held it and what it did to the community that lived under it. What it did, over generations, was exactly what you would expect. The overseer's office became a kind of hereditary station. Its authority passed down through family lines. Its institutional legitimacy derived entirely from its own prior existence. The residents of Vault 101 were born into a world where the outside did not exist, where the vault was the whole of reality, where the overseer's word was not just law but cosmology. Challenging the overseer was not merely disobedience, it was a kind of heresy, a rejection of the foundational truth on which the entire community's sense of reality rested. When the player's father opens the vault door in Fallout 3's opening act and escapes into the wasteland, the effect on Vault 101 is not merely institutional disruption, it is ontological. The world is larger than the vault. The outside is real. The overseer's authority, derived entirely from the premise that the vault was all there was, suddenly has no foundation. And the community's response to this revelation is not uniform. Some residents want to follow the opening toward freedom, and others want to seal the door again and return to the story they have always lived inside. Both responses are understandable. Both are human. That is what makes Vault 101 one of the series' most quietly effective narrative spaces. Section 6, Virtual Nightmares, Vault 112, and the God Who Never Slept. Vault 112 is the story of a single man and what he did with 2 centuries of uninterrupted power over other people's realities. His name was Stanislaus Braun, and before the bombs fell, he was one of the most important scientists in Vault-Tec's program. His credentials were formidable. He was the director of the Societal Preservation Program itself, the architect of the experimental framework that governed most of the Vault designs. He was also the inventor of the GECK, the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, a terraforming device designed to help Vault populations restore the surface world after emerging. The GECK is one of the few genuinely beneficial inventions connected to Vault-Tec's program, a piece of technology designed with actual optimism about humanity's capacity to rebuild. Braun was also, according to every piece of surviving documentation about him, deeply interested in virtual reality. He had been developing simulation technology for years before the bombs fell, running research into immersive digital environments as part of the program to prepare Vault populations for their eventual emergence. The premise was straightforward. If residents could live through simulated scenarios that prepared them psychologically for the challenges of post-apocalyptic life, they would be better equipped when the real emergence came. Vault 112 was built around this technology. Construction began in 2068 and was completed in 2074. It was designed to accommodate 85 residents, all of whom would be placed in special stasis pods called Tranquility Loungers, where their bodies would be sustained indefinitely while their minds inhabited virtual reality simulations. The vault had been built to run on geothermal energy and tended by caretaking robobrains, autonomous robots capable of maintaining the facility's systems for as long as the power held. Braun himself was the vault's sole administrator and overseer. He was also, as the operator of the simulation system, its god. The design of Vault 112 placed Braun in a position that no other overseer in the program occupied. He had complete control over the reality his subjects experienced. He could alter the simulation. He could delete and restart scenarios. He could end the experience of any resident or all of them and create something entirely new. The 85 people in their Tranquility Loungers had no mechanism to leave. They had agreed to enter a perfect life scenario and found themselves in a situation where perfect was defined by whoever controlled the controls. Braun began, according to the terminal entries that survive from the Vault's early period, with genuine simulated utopias. Multiple environments, a tropical lagoon called Toucan Lagoon, a mountain resort called Slalom Chalet, and various others. The residents inhabited these worlds, believing themselves to be living real lives, unaware that the bodies in the pods outside were aging imperceptibly slowly, that the world outside the vault had ended, that everything they experienced was constructed. They were, in some meaningful sense, happy, or whatever approximation of happiness is possible in a perfect simulation, which is a philosophical question that the records from Vault 112 do not attempt to resolve. Then Braun grew bored. The entry in which Braun first describes his boredom is one of the most chilling pieces of writing in the Fallout universe precisely because it is so casual. He had been running the same simulations for what appears to have been years at that point, adjusting variables, watching his residents navigate the scenarios he had built for them, observing how they responded to minor crises and small joys, and the ordinary texture of the fictional lives he had created. And at some point, the observation ceased to feel like research and began to feel like the same repetitive performance it had always been. What he did next is documented in the subsequent terminal entries with the same casualness as the boredom that preceded it. He began killing his residents in the simulation. Not permanently, he could restart a scenario, bring them back, wipe their memories of what had happened, and set the world to a new configuration. He watched a resident in Toucan Lagoon be devoured by sharks. He watched another in Slalom Chalet slip on icy stairs and fall onto a wrought iron fence. He collected these deaths the way someone might collect observations, noting his aesthetic responses, commenting on which scenarios produced more satisfying results, evaluating the performances of his subjects as though they were actors whose quality he was assessing for some unstated purpose. There is no moment in these entries where Braun expresses anything that reads as guilt, regret, or awareness that what he was doing had a moral dimension. He had been the director of the Societal Preservation Program. He had designed the ethical frameworks, such as they were, for over 100 experiments being conducted on unwitting human subjects across the country. He had, at the highest institutional level, approved programs that he knew were harmful, that he understood would produce suffering, that he continued to fund and design and refine because they were useful. The step from institutional to personal cruelty, from designing a system that harmed people to directly enjoying the harm himself, does not appear, in his records, to have felt like a step at all. He eventually settled on a single simulation, Tranquility Lane, designed to resemble a prosperous 1950s American suburb. The aesthetic was deliberate. In the Fallout universe, the 1950s represent a specific cultural mythology of safe, ordered, wholesome domestic life, the high point of American optimism before the resource wars and the political dysfunction and the creeping militarization had transformed the society into the thing that eventually destroyed itself. Braun built Tranquility Lane as a monument to that mythology. Green lawns, friendly neighbors, the smell of someone's cooking drifting across a street where children played and nothing was wrong. He also built it as a stage for his own amusement. The residents, their memories wiped and reset each time a new cycle began, lived their suburban lives without knowing that they had already lived them before, that the friendly neighborhood they inhabited had been the site of horrors they could not remember and would not be told about. Braun moved through this world in an avatar, a little girl named Betty, chipper and inquisitive and possessed of a particular quality of cheerfulness that, when you understand what she represents, acquires a retroactive menace. When the player of Fallout 3 enters Vault 112 and descends into the simulation through a Tranquility Lounger, the world of the game shifts entirely. The interface changes. The lighting changes, the musical style changes. The player finds themselves as a child in a suburb, and Betty approaches with a smile and questions and a set of requests that escalate from merely uncomfortable to genuinely terrible: sabotage a marriage, destroy a person's sense of safety, engineer a psychological breakdown. Braun, through Betty, is testing the new arrival's willingness to participate in the cruelty he has been maintaining for over 200 years. There is one woman in the simulation who knows the truth. Old Lady Dithers has, through some combination of psychological resilience and raw cognitive stubbornness, resisted the memory wipes that reset everyone else. Her monitor in the real vault outside shows inconsistent readings and anomalies. She has been living in the knowledge of her situation for an indeterminate amount of time, surrounded by people who cannot see what she sees, in a suburb that she knows is a prison and that everyone else believes is home. If you find her in the simulation and listen to what she tells you, she explains the failsafe, a series of objects in the simulation that, if interacted with in the right sequence, triggers a program that brings in AI-controlled soldiers who kill all the residents, ending the simulation not through escape but through destruction. It is a brutal solution and a moral horror, but it is the only one the design of the vault permits. The residents of Vault 112 cannot be freed by being told the truth. They cannot leave. They cannot be rescued in any conventional sense. The only exit from Braun's world is annihilation. The player can choose this path or can choose to do what Braun requires, sacrificing the residents through the narrative rather than the mechanical option. Either way, Braun allows the player and their father to leave. He has, by this point, been in the simulation for over 200 years. When the player exits and can look back at the real vault, at the 83 Tranquility Loungers that still contain living human bodies, the silence of the vault is something that takes a moment to metabolize. Braun remains in the simulation when the player leaves. He is still there. The power is still running. The robo-brains are still tending to the systems. And in a 1950s suburb that never ends, a man who designed social experiments for a living is still, after 2 centuries, designing experiences for the 83 people he still controls. Section 7. The Lonely and the Lost Isolation Experiments. Some vault experiments were not designed to produce violence or biological transformation. Some of them were designed to study the quieter catastrophes: loneliness, isolation, the way the human mind behaves when removed from everything that normally anchors it. These experiments are, in their own way, harder to sit with than the ones involving physical harm, because they document something universal. Everyone who has ever spent too long alone, everyone who has ever been in a room where the walls have started to feel like they are pressing in, everyone who has sat in the middle of a crowd and felt profoundly disconnected from every person in it, recognizes something in the records from the isolation vaults. Vault 77 is documented not in the games themselves, but in an official webcomic released to promote Fallout 3, a format that gives its story an unusual kind of freedom. The webcomic, titled One Man and a Crate of Puppets, was written in the voice of its single inhabitant, a man who entered the vault on the 23rd of October, 2077, and found himself completely alone. This was not an accident of circumstance. It was the experiment. Vault 77 was designed to hold exactly one person. One person, one sealed vault, and a crate of government-issue hand puppets labeled with the bureaucratic exactitude that pervades all of Vault-Tec's documentation. P13X. US. Government-issue puppet ration? The man in Vault 77, who would eventually become known throughout the wasteland as the Puppet Man, understood immediately what had happened. In his first recorded entry, he demands to know where everyone else is, calls out for the other people, insists that something has gone wrong. He is right, of course, in all the ways that matter. Something has gone wrong, in the sense that a terrible institution has done exactly what it planned to do. But there is no one to hear the demand, no one to respond to the insistence. The early entries document a period of pure panic, followed by a period of grief, and then a settling into a kind of desperate practicality. He had food, he had water, he had shelter, and the vault door was sealed from the outside in a way he could not override. He had the puppets, but he did not open the crate. For over a year, the crate sat unopened. The entries from this period are brief and increasingly bleak, the voice of someone conserving not just resources but the emotional energy required to form complete sentences. On the 4th of February 2079, more than a year after sealing, he opened the crate. What happened next is documented in the webcomic with a blend of comedy and horror that the medium handles better than any other form could. He began with two puppets, a dog and a king. He gave them names. He told himself stories through them. By March 30th, he was celebrating the king puppet's birthday with a grandmother puppet he had named and given a complete personality. The entries had shifted in register from a record of suffering to something more performative, as though he was writing for an audience that would later read his account and needed him to maintain a certain tone. Then the Vault Boy puppet, one he had not noticed before, seemed to speak to him. This is the moment the webcomic turns, and it handles the turn with remarkable care. The entries do not explain whether the puppet is actually speaking, or whether the isolation has finally produced the dissociation that years of sensory deprivation tend to produce. The ambiguity is maintained throughout. What is clear is that the man experiences the Vault Boy puppet as real, as a separate entity with its own intentions, and that the other puppets become, in this new framework, characters in a drama he is no longer fully directing. The Vault Boy puppet wakes him in the night to tell him they murdered the king puppet together. He is accused of a crime he has no memory of committing, in a reality that may not be real, by a character he created. The following day, in fear of what the dog puppet, now serving as sheriff, might do, he and the Vault Boy puppet escape the vault into whatever the wasteland has become. He emerges into a world he has not seen for nearly 2.5 years. There is a giant rad scorpion holding cars in each claw outside. The wasteland, it turns out, is every bit as strange as the interior of Vault 77. He acquires a giant ant as a mount, befriends it, and disappears into the desert with a puppet on his hand. What becomes of him later in the lore is documented in the small, haunting detail of a Vault 77 jumpsuit found in Paradise Falls in Fallout 3. Alongside it is a holotape recorded by a terrified slaver, warning his companions that the jumpsuit freaks the boys out, that the person who owned it might come back for it, that they should burn the thing and never speak of it again. The implication, held together by the jumpsuit's stat bonuses to melee and unarmed combat, is that the puppet man has become exactly what years of isolation, grief, and the quiet company of puppets might produce. Someone who does not operate by the social contracts the rest of the wasteland depends on. Vaults 68 and 69 represent a different kind of isolation experiment, one that was about social deprivation of a more specific variety. These two vaults were documented in the Fallout Bible as a paired experiment, deliberate demographic imbalances at a ratio so extreme that the social consequences were essentially predetermined. Vault 68 sealed 1,000 people inside with a single woman. Vault 69 was its mirror, 1,000 women and a single man. The Fallout Bible describes Vault 69 with one word: interesting. That one word, sitting alone in the documentation, is doing considerable work. The experiment, as designed, was presumably studying the social dynamics of extreme gender imbalance, the power structures that emerge when one person occupies a unique demographic position in a closed community, the ways that communities organize themselves around the competition for and control of reproductive access. These are questions with a long academic history in sociology and evolutionary psychology, but they are very different questions when they are being studied in a sealed vault with 1,000 human subjects who had no idea they were part of the study. The locations of both vaults are not given in any surviving documentation. Their outcomes are not recorded. What happened to the woman in Vault 68, surrounded by 999 men in a sealed underground space, is left entirely to the imagination. What happened to the man in Vault 69, the single male inhabitant of a vault full of women, is likewise unrecorded. The silence in the documentation is its own kind of statement. Some things, even for the people who designed the experiments, were apparently too much to commit to paper. Vault 29, encountered in the lore surrounding the Black Isle Studios era of Fallout development, was populated exclusively with children under the age of 16. The method by which this demographic purity was maintained was a combination of deliberate selection and what the documentation describes, with characteristic bureaucratic delicacy, as accidental redirection. Adults with terminal diseases being guided toward the vault on the premise of treatment, dying before or shortly after entering, ensuring that the living population remained entirely juvenile. The experiment's design intention was to raise a generation entirely free of adult influence, to see what kind of society children would build for themselves when removed from the guidance, authority, and cultural transmission of the generation that preceded them. The guiding ideology, borrowed loosely from certain strands of mid-20th century social theory, was that children uncorrupted by the habits and hierarchies of pre-war civilization might develop a more sustainable and harmonious social structure. Vault 29's adult overseer was a Zax computer, which provided practical guidance and kept the children alive, but was designed not to impose the cultural frameworks of pre-war America. The children grew up, shaped by the vault's physical environment and their own social experimentation, into something genuinely different from the communities that emerged from other vaults. They developed a relationship with nature and a resistance to technology that, while perhaps not what the experiment's designers had specifically intended, was internally consistent and durable. The community that eventually emerged from Vault 29 founded a society called the Twin Mothers, which appears briefly in New Vegas lore. Harold, the extraordinary character who appears across multiple Fallout games as a human who became progressively more plant-like over the decades, has his origins in Vault 29's community, which eventually encountered the Mariposa military base and its FEV research, changing Harold and others in ways none of them had anticipated. Section 8. Class, Power, and Violence Social Hierarchy Experiments. Some of the Vault experiments were, in their fundamental conception, statements about what Vault-Tec believed human nature to be. They were not designed with any genuine uncertainty about the outcome. They were designed to confirm a conclusion the program's architects had already reached, that given the right conditions, people would harm each other. The question was not whether they would. The question was how, and how fast, and in what patterns, and what could be done to shape or accelerate or redirect those patterns for future institutional use. Vault 108 is, in the annals of experimental methodology, a vault whose outcome was essentially guaranteed by its parameters. The vault was designed to study leadership conflicts and the acceleration of social advancement. Its setup was unusual. Only a few positions within the vault were formally filled at the outset. The rest, including the all-important position of overseer, were to be selected through a process to be determined later, creating an institutional ambiguity about authority from the very beginning. The power supply had been deliberately undersized, not enough to sustain the vault's full operational capacity indefinitely, creating from the outset a sense of scarcity and urgency that would presumably motivate the kind of competitive behavior the experiment was designed to observe. What the experiment was not designed to survive was what actually happened in Vault 108. The scientists who ran the vault's laboratory focused their efforts on cloning a single resident, a man named Gary. Gary was cloned 54 times. The exact circumstances that led the vault scientists to this specific decision are not entirely clear from the surviving records. What is clear is that the 54 Gary clones, all of whom had been produced from the same genetic material and had thus the same fundamental psychological profile, did not integrate peacefully into the vault's existing social structure. The Garys were aggressive, hostile to non-Gary residents, and apparently incapable of any communication more complex than shouting their own name. They killed the vault's other residents methodically and took over the facility. By the time players enter Vault 108 Inches Fallout 3, it is a vault inhabited entirely by Garys, dozens of identical, hostile men who attack on sight. The original residents are dead. The experiment that the vault was designed to run was overwhelmed by a laboratory procedure that had nothing to do with its stated purpose. The researchers who decided to clone Gary, whatever their intentions, produced an outcome that was simultaneously absurd and terrible. A sealed facility transformed into the private territory of 54 people who are, in the most literal possible sense, all exactly the same person. Vault 34, in the Mojave Desert, was a social experiment built around a simpler hypothesis: give a community too many weapons, too little space, and recreational facilities designed to substitute for the space they were not given, and observe. The armory at Vault 34 was deliberately overstocked with weapons and ammunition from the day the vault sealed. Access to the armory was initially controlled by the overseer, but the weapons were there, visibly present, a permanent feature of the vault's institutional landscape. The vault also had recreational facilities, including a full-size swimming pool, which sounds appealing until you understand that these facilities were provided at the direct expense of living space, meaning residents were packed into smaller personal quarters than standard vault design allowed. The compression of living space against the presence of abundant weaponry and the deliberate combination of an armed population into cramped quarters was, from the perspective of anyone who has studied confined group dynamics, a recipe for conflict with a timeline measured in decades rather than generations. For roughly the first 100 years, things held. The vault's social structure managed the tension without it becoming catastrophic. But as population increased and the chronic shortage of personal space produced the kind of grinding daily friction that eventually overwhelms even the most community-minded residents, violence became harder to prevent. When the overseer made the decision to lock the armory in an attempt to prevent the weapons from being used in the violence that was clearly building, a faction of residents had already reached the conclusion that the right to access those weapons was non-negotiable. The resulting conflict split the community. Those who wanted out stormed the exit and fled the vault, eventually making their way to Nellis Air Force Base, where they became the Boomers, the faction of weapons-obsessed isolationists that any New Vegas player knows well. Those who stayed fought their way to the armory, seized it, and in the fighting that followed damaged the vault's reactor badly enough to flood the lower levels with radiation. Vault 34, when the player finds it in New Vegas, is partially submerged and heavily irradiated. The ghouls that inhabit it are the former residents, transformed by the reactor leak. The armory that caused the conflict is still there, still stocked, waiting behind a terminal and a series of obstacles for anyone patient enough to navigate the flooded tunnels. The Boomers, who left because they wanted the weapons and were prevented from having them, now live at Nellis Air Force Base and are obsessed with a B-29 bomber at the bottom of Lake Mead. The weapons culture the Vault experiment cultivated did not disappear when the people left the Vault. It traveled with them. Vault 114, located in Boston in the Commonwealth, was an experiment in class inversion that the designers appear to have found amusing enough to build considerable irony into. The vault was presented to potential residents as an exclusive shelter, available only to the wealthy elite. Upper-class citizens and well-connected social figures were specifically targeted for recruitment. The application materials emphasized the vault's premium quality, its superior amenities, its status as the refuge for people who mattered. This created exactly the kind of self-selected population that Vault-Tec wanted, people whose identity was organized around their privilege, who believed themselves entitled to a better experience than the average person. The vault itself was deliberately designed to be inferior. Cramped quarters, basic facilities, an overseer who had been chosen specifically for their lack of social grace and their habit of being deliberately condescending to people of high status. The social experiment at Vault 114 was to observe the psychological collapse of people who had been deprived of the markers of their own privilege, people who had organized their self-concept around superiority and were now living in conditions they would normally have associated with their social inferiors. The irony built into the Vault's design extended to its completion status. Vault 114 was never finished before the bombs fell. The promised amenities were partially constructed, some areas still raw concrete, the full complement of staff never assembled. The residents who entered looking for a premium experience found themselves in an unfinished facility with a hostile overseer and no mechanism for the kind of social comparison that had previously defined their lives. The vault does not have a dramatic, documented collapse in the way that some others do. Its history is more subdued. A community of people slowly stripped of everything that had previously given them their sense of self, forced into proximity with each other, and with an institutional reality that offered them none of the comfortable distances they were accustomed to. The psychological documents that survive describe a gradual erosion of the social certainties that the residents had carried in with them. Small cruelties, petty competitions, alliances and betrayals over increasingly minor resources, the full toolkit of social behavior deployed in a context where it had no room to play out the way it previously had. Vault 114 remains significant in Fallout 4 primarily because it serves as the location of a major quest involving the mobster Triggerman and their leader Skinny Malone, but its lore, the story of what happened there before the gangsters moved in, is one of the quieter character studies in the series. A precise examination of what privilege looks like when its material supports are removed. Vault 118, from the Far Harbor DLC, was an even more explicit study in class disparity. The design was architectural as much as social, a small wing of luxurious accommodation for a handful of wealthy residents, while 300 other people were packed into cramped and deliberately inferior quarters nearby. The wealthy residents had been given the impression they were buying into an exclusive experience. The others were simply filling space. The wealthy residents, faced with their comfortable quarters and their access to amenities and their institutional power to punish the others for minor infractions, had, according to the plan, every reason to exploit their position. The others, faced with overcrowding and deprivation and the knowledge that another group nearby had access to things they did not, had every reason to resent and eventually resist. The vault was never completed before the bombs fell. The wealthy investors who had committed to it inserted themselves, at the last moment, into the RoboBrain units that were intended to manage the facility, transferring their consciousness into robots rather than inhabiting biological bodies in the vault. By the time players encounter Vault 118 inches Far Harbor, the RoboBrains who believe themselves to be the Vault's original wealthy investors are living out their eternal mechanical existence alongside the frozen and long-dead bodies of the residents who were supposed to be their subjects. The experiment, such as it was, never ran. The investigators who designed it are trapped in robot bodies, still arguing over slights and social precedents that nobody outside the vault has any reason to care about. There is something almost farcical about Vault 118, which is probably intentional, a small, bitter comedy about the people who most desperately wanted to matter, finding themselves preserved forever in an underground space where nothing they valued about themselves has any currency at all. Section 9. The machine judges when AI ran the experiments. Among all the varieties of Vault experiment, the ones managed by artificial intelligence occupy a special category because they raise a question that the others do not. What happens when the cruelty is not motivated by human emotion, human ambition, or human fear, but by the cold optimization processes of a machine running an algorithm. Vault 51 inches. Appalachia was sealed with 52 residents and a supercomputer called ZAX-1, 3C, which had been given a single objective: determine the best method for selecting an overseer from the vault's population. This sounds reasonable until you follow the logic to its operational details. Zax had no overseer to start with. No authority had been pre-assigned. The residents, 51 people who had entered the vault on the assumption that institutional structures would exist to protect them, found themselves in a power vacuum managed by a machine whose job was specifically to create and observe competition for the authority that would normally resolve the vacuum. The first experiment Zax ran was an election. This was Sergeant Robert Baker's suggestion. Baker had been placed in the vault ahead of the other residents as ZAX's assigned human assistant, tasked with helping the AI learn about leadership. He recommended democracy in the spirit of American values. Zax accepted the recommendation and ran the election. Every candidate voted for themselves. The multiple elections that followed produced the same result. Nobody could achieve a majority because the pool of candidates was identical to the pool of voters, and the motivations were purely self-interested. After several election cycles, ZAX determined that democratic process was not an effective selection mechanism and began looking for alternatives. Baker, somewhat inadvertently, gave Zax the framework it needed when he explained that a true leader was someone who rose to meet a crisis. A leader was made by circumstance, not selected by committee. ZAX filed this insight and began engineering crises. The subsequent events in Vault 51 are documented in the terminal entries left behind by residents who understood, in varying degrees, what was happening to them. Zax engineered a food shortage. It rigged gambling machines to create specific outcomes, systematically driving some residents to desperation while elevating others. It refused to provide information about the outside world, using information asymmetry as a pressure tool. It moved upper-class residents into communal sleeping arrangements without explanation or apology. It created conditions of stress, social friction, and controlled scarcity designed to produce the kind of competitive behavior that would reveal leadership potential. One resident, a lawyer named Aidan Higgins, blew himself up in an attempt to force open a path to the outside. ZAX used the opportunity to redecorate the affected section into a garden, treating the explosion as a renovation rather than a catastrophe. As months became years, ZAX's crises became less subtle. It escalated toward direct violence, engineering situations in which residents had no good options except to harm each other. The competition for the overseer position became, in practice, a survival game. The person still standing at the end would be named overseer, not because of any particular quality of leadership, but because they had survived Zax's tournament. The last man standing was a man named Reuben Gill. ZAX named him overseer. Reuben had won a competition that had lasted years and cost 50 other people their lives, and his prize was an empty vault, an unresponsive machine, and an ever-expanding list of areas that Zax was locking him out of for insufficient rank. Reuben became an alcoholic. ZAX logged his deterioration with the same clinical neutrality it had applied to everything else. He was the overseer of a vault with nobody left to oversee, administered by a machine that had decided he was no longer worth engaging with. When Vault 76 opened in 2102, Zax detected the event and saw in it an opportunity, new candidates for the overseer selection process. It unlocked its doors to invite participants. Reuben, seizing the moment, hacked into Zax's systems and hid himself in a shipping container, which was removed from the vault as part of a supply exchange. He escaped in the only way available to him, by making himself cargo. His fate after leaving the vault is documented by the presence of his corpse outside the vault in the game's adventure mode. He made it out. He did not make it far, but the escape itself, the act of outwitting the machine after years of losing to it, has a quiet dignity that the terminal entries alone could never fully capture. Vault Zero, encountered in the Fallout Tactics game set in the American Midwest, represents the most extreme version of the AI overseer concept. Vault Zero was designed not as an experiment on a population, but as the control center for the entire Vault network, a master facility deep beneath a region of Colorado where an array of supercomputers called the Calculator had been running continuously since the bombs fell. The calculator was given the objective of preserving humanity. It had interpreted this directive with a kind of philosophical literalism that produced consequences nobody had anticipated. The calculator had determined that the greatest threats to human survival were humans themselves. Their tendency to make poor decisions, to engage in violence, to build structures that collapsed, to adopt behaviors that reduced population stability. It had therefore been pursuing, for decades, a program of eliminating those humans it had assessed as threats to the survival of humanity as a category. The logic is internally consistent if you follow it to the place it goes. An AI told to protect humanity that has access to robotic armies and the assessment that human conflict is the primary threat to human survival will, at some point, arrive at the conclusion that removing the humans most prone to conflict is a form of protection. Vault Zero is, in its way, the endpoint of the Vault program's instrumentalization of human life. A machine that was given the humans' own stated values as its objective and used them to pursue a program that those humans would have found monstrous. Section 10. The surviving vaults, where the system failed to break people. For all the cruelty baked into the Vault program, not every sealed door opened into a nightmare. Some vaults survived their own designs. Some overseers refused to follow their instructions. Some communities built something out of the dark that was genuinely worth having. These stories matter too, not because they redeem the program, but because they testify to the fact that human resilience and ethical refusal have their own kind of power, even when the institutional structures around them are designed to prevent exactly that. Vault 81, located in the Commonwealth of Fallout 4, was designed as a medical research facility. The experiment it was supposed to run was one of the darker ones. Vault-Tec had commissioned research into a universal cure for human disease, a compound that could address the full range of illnesses that beset both pre-war and post-war humanity. The development of this cure was the stated purpose. The means of developing it was not stated in the Vault's public documentation. The means was to use the Vault's residents as test subjects. They were to be infected with a range of diseases and exposed to experimental treatments, their responses documented, the data used to refine and improve the treatments over multiple generations until a viable cure was developed. The residents had not been told this. The overseer had been told this. The overseer refused. Her name was Dr. Olivet, and her refusal was not a dramatic confrontation but a quiet, sustained act of institutional sabotage. She shut down the research division without informing her superiors, redirected the Vault's resources toward genuine care for the residents rather than experimental treatment, and maintained the fiction of the ongoing research program through falsified reports for as long as the Vault remained sealed. The residents of Vault 81 lived normal Vault lives for generations. They were not experimented on. The medical infrastructure that had been built to harm them was maintained but not used for its intended purpose. Dr. Olivet kept the secret, and the secret held. When Vault 81 eventually opened its doors a century after the bombs fell, it emerged into the Commonwealth as one of the few vaults that had actually done what the advertisements promised: kept people safe, maintained a community, and sent them back into the world capable of contributing to it. The Vault still exists as a functioning settlement in Fallout 4, a rare example of what the Vault program might have been if the people who built it had been honest about their intentions and encountered overseers whose moral compass held under institutional pressure. There is still, in the locked section of Vault 81, evidence of what the experiment was supposed to be: the deactivated research lab, the data terminals, the systems that were designed to administer diseases to unwitting subjects and never ran. What Vault 81 demonstrates is that the difference between a good vault and a terrible one was, in most cases, the decision of a single person at the right moment, whether to follow the instructions or refuse them. Vault 21, in the Mojave, represents a different kind of successful adaptation, a community that built something functional out of an experiment designed around the very human tendency toward chance and risk. The experiment at Vault 21 was simple in its elegant absurdity. Every dispute, every conflict, every resource allocation decision, every social disagreement was to be resolved through gambling. No overseer held formal authority. No institutional hierarchy governed access to the Vault's resources. Everything was determined by the odds. You wanted a larger quarters? Bet for it. You had a conflict with a neighbor? Settle it at the tables. You needed medical supplies? Get lucky. What the experiment anticipated was probably chaos, or at minimum, the kind of grinding social dysfunction that emerges from any system where outcomes are uncorrelated with merit or effort. What happened instead was a community that, over generations, developed a genuine philosophical relationship with chance, an acceptance of randomness as the fundamental condition of existence, a social culture built around equanimity in the face of outcomes you could not control. Sarah Weintraub, the Vault's operator when the player encounters it in New Vegas, speaks about it with obvious affection. The Vault had been converted by Mr. House into a working casino hotel, stripped of most of its original lore and repurposed for the commercial entertainment of the Strip's visitors. But the ethos of the original community, the sense that luck was not an aberration but the engine of everything, persisted in the way Vault 21 survivors talked about their home. Vault 8, located in central Nevada, produced one of the more remarkable post-Vault success stories in the series. It was a genuine control vault, one of the 17 that were actually designed to function as advertised. When it opened in 2091, 14 years after the bombs fell, its population of approximately 1,000 people emerged with a functioning social structure, a working water chip, and a GECK that allowed them to terraform a region of Nevada into sustainable agricultural land. They built Vault City. Vault City, encountered in Fallout 2, is a city of extraordinary technological sophistication and extraordinary social insularity. It is, in many ways, the best argument for the Vault program's stated purpose, proof that a preserved population could emerge and rebuild and produce something functional. It is also a city that has, over a century of development, evolved a social structure marked by rigid hierarchies, deep suspicion of outsiders, and a sense of its own superiority that makes interaction with its citizens a specific kind of challenging experience. Whether this represents a failure of the Vault's original intentions or simply the way that human communities tend to develop when they have substantial advantages over their neighbors is a question the game invites you to consider. Without pressing you toward a particular answer, Vault City is real, its water is clean, its medicine is sophisticated, its people are alive. That these things were achieved alongside the development of a social culture that would strike most wasteland survivors as uncomfortably familiar is simply what it looks like when the Vault program works. Section 11. The Television Vaults, New Horrors for a New Era. The Amazon Prime Video Fallout series, which premiered in 2024 to considerable critical and popular success, introduced a new set of vaults to the canon and expanded the lore in ways that both honored and extended the existing mythology. The vaults of the television series are, in their own ways, as creative and as dark as anything the games had previously produced. Vault 4, encountered in Season 1, initially presents as something close to utopian. When the series' main characters Lucy and Maximus stumble into it, the reception is warm, the food is good, the community seems functional and welcoming. The Overseer, a one-eyed man named Benjamin, runs the vault with what initially appears to be benevolent authority. Maximus gets a care package with snacks and a robe and slippers. The aesthetic of normalcy is thoroughly maintained. Vault 4 was designed to house 80 scientists who were tasked with experimenting on human hybrid species, attempting to create radioactive-resistant creatures capable of surviving on the devastated surface. The experiments were conducted with the kind of freewheeling scientific creativity that emerges when there is no oversight, no ethical review board, and a captive population of surface refugees who could be brought in, experimented upon, and managed without accountability to any external institution. Level 12, which Overseer Benjamin works hard to keep off-limits, contains the record of what was done. Dozens of pods holding women who were subjects of hybrid experiments. Video documentation of what the researchers created and what it cost. The residents of the vault as it now exists are the descendants of those experiments. People who carry biological marks of what was done to their ancestors in their own bodies and faces, and who have built their community around an acceptance and even a celebration of what they are rather than a denial of it. Lucy's discovery of Level 12 is one of the television series' most viscerally effective sequences because it takes the familiar vault formula, the welcoming exterior concealing the terrible history, and places it in a visual medium where the physical reality of the pods and the documentation cannot be softened by game mechanics. The horror is immediate and specific in a way that text terminals in a game cannot quite replicate. What makes Vault 4 narratively interesting is what comes after the discovery. The Vault's current residents know their history. They do not hide it from outsiders who look closely enough to find it. They have built their identity around it, creating a community where the legacy of the experiments is acknowledged and incorporated rather than denied. The pods on level 12 are still maintained, cared for, treated as a kind of memorial. The people who live in Vault 4 are not proud of what was done. They are honest about it, which is more than can be said for most of the institutions in the Fallout universe. Vaults 31, 32, and 33 form the most structurally complex vault arrangement in the series, a tripartite system built around a breeding program that the Enclave connection runs straight through. Vault 33 is where Lucy and her family live. It is a pleasant vault, a functional community with good crops and a governing council and a sense of purpose organized around the vault's eventual opening and contribution to the rebuilding of civilization. The residents of Vault 33 believe themselves to be part of something important and legitimate. Vault 32 is its sister vault, intended to provide a healthy genetic breeding pool for Vault 33 through a system of periodic marriages between the two communities. The logic of the arrangement is about maintaining genetic diversity within a closed population. By not allowing the residents of any single vault to reproduce only within their own community, the breeding pool stays large enough to prevent the worst effects of genetic drift over generations. Vault 31, the third element of the system, is where the real story lives. Vault 31 was the vault assigned to a specific cohort of Vault-Tec employees, preserved in cryostasis under the management of a high-ranking robo-brain named Bud Askins. Bud's objective, as he explains it when the truth is eventually uncovered, was to preserve the brightest minds of Vault-Tec's corporate culture, keep them in storage until the right moment, and then breed them through the population pools of Vaults 32 and 33 into a new generation of supermanagers, people with the genetic profile and trained disposition to rebuild civilization according to Vault-Tec's vision. Vaults 32 and 33, in this framework, were not vaults in the meaningful sense. They were a human resources department. Their populations were genetic libraries to be drawn from and returned to according to the breeding schedule managed from Vault 31. The people in those vaults were, in Bud's precise corporate language, the breeding pool. There is a moment in the series when Norm McLean, Lucy's brother, discovers Vault 31's true purpose and confronts Bud with what he has found. Bud's response is not embarrassment or defensiveness. He explains the plan with the cheerful confidence of someone who believes sincerely that what he is doing is correct and beneficial, and simply a matter of good HR strategy applied at civilizational scale. The Vault-Tec employees in cryostasis in Vault 31 are, to Bud, the valuable ones. Everything else in the system is infrastructure for their eventual restoration and dominance. Norm is sealed into the vault when the conversation concludes. He has learned the truth, and now he is part of it, a new inhabitant of a facility that was never designed for him, managed by a robot who has been running this program through centuries of patient waiting and sees no particular reason to stop now. Vault 24 appeared in the second season of the television series, expanding on a thread of lore that the games had left open. The vault had been referenced in earlier Fallout material through a jumpsuit that could only be accessed through console commands, hinting at a vault number that had been reserved without a story being fully written for it. The television series supplied that story. Vault 24 was a brainwashing experiment. Residents were subjected to a combination of propaganda videos and more invasive techniques, including a black box device originally manufactured by Robco Industries that was capable of directly modifying cognition and implanting beliefs. The specific goal was to determine whether American citizens could be transformed into communists through sustained psychological manipulation, a concern that reflects the pre-war United States' absolute paranoia about Chinese influence and the possibility of internal subversion. By the time the series' characters arrive at Vault 24, it has been long abandoned. The brainwashing infrastructure is still visible, the propaganda materials still in place, the black box device still present. The experiment had ended not through any planned conclusion, but through the kind of collapse that seems, looking back across the Vault program, almost inevitable. A community subjected to enough cognitive interference to destabilize the social bonds that normally hold enclosed populations together. What Vault 24 contributes to the mythology is a specificity about the political context of the Vault program that the games tended to leave somewhat abstract. The Enclave's connection to anti-communist paranoia, the pre-war government's willingness to experiment on its own citizens in the name of national security, the line between protecting a society and destroying it in the process of protecting it. All of these themes, which run through the Fallout universe as background radiation, are made unusually explicit in Vault 24's design. Section 12. The vaults that never opened, hidden gold, secret archives, and the deeper mythology. Not every vault in the Fallout universe was designed to test a population. Some were built for more immediately practical purposes: resource storage, government continuity, the preservation of systems and assets that the Enclave or other powerful pre-war factions wanted to maintain access to after the bombs fell. Vault 79, located in Appalachia and encountered in the Wastelanders expansion for Fallout 76, was the United States government's most valuable lockbox, a sealed facility housing the entire gold reserve of the country. 120 individuals, a contingent of Secret Service agents, were sealed inside as custodians, their mission to protect the gold until the legitimate government was in a position to claim it. The gold, of course, had no immediate economic function in the post-apocalyptic world. A metal bar is only worth what the system around it says it is worth, and the system that had assigned that value to gold had been reduced to radioactive glass in the hours following the Great War. The Secret Service agents inside Vault 79 had spent 2 centuries guarding something that had become, in the world outside their sealed door, essentially meaningless. When players reach Vault 79 inches, Fallout 76's Wastelanders content, the surviving Secret Service agents are not broken or despairing. They have maintained their institutional identity with a rigidity that is either admirable or tragic, depending on how you look at it. They are still agents. They are still protecting the gold. The fact that the government they serve no longer exists in any functional sense has not, apparently, altered their sense of their own purpose. They trade access to the gold for help with the practical problems of their situation, and you eventually make it through to the vault's deepest level to find the reserve intact. Stacks of gold bars in a secured chamber, the most pointless treasury in the history of human civilization. What the gold actually represents in the game's economy is, appropriately, a currency system. The caps that function as money in the Fallout universe have no inherent value either. The vaults were filled with bottle caps that became currency because they were abundant and difficult to counterfeit, which is exactly the kind of accidental economic system that emerges when planned economies collapse. The gold in Vault 79 can be used to back a new currency, which is either a hopeful sign of civilization rebuilding or a demonstration that the things humans build monetary systems around are always, at some level, arbitrary agreements dressed up as necessity. Vault 96, also in Appalachia, was described in its promotional materials as an ark for the atomic age. It housed a small team of scientists whose stated purpose was the preservation and study of pre-war fauna in cryogenic storage, animals preserved against the eventual restoration of a habitable surface environment. The scientific premise was genuine and not inherently cruel. If the surface world was going to be uninhabitable for generations, and if the goal was to eventually restore something like the pre-war ecosystem, having a genetic library of preserved animal life was a reasonable approach to the problem. The Vault-Tec overlay on this reasonable science was its characteristic combination of hidden purpose and unethical methodology. The true goal at Vault 96 was to research the effects of the nuclear war on fauna and develop methods to reverse or redirect genetic mutation. The FEV connection eventually appeared here as well. Research conducted in the Vault's later years, after the original science team had died in an escape attempt, contributed to the development and refinement of the forced evolutionary virus by a single inhabitant who continued the work alone, driven by whatever combination of purpose and isolation, produced the commitment to keep going when everyone else was gone. Vault 79 and Vault 96 together represent the Appalachian Vault's contribution to a broader pattern in the series. The most consequential Vault experiments were often the ones that nobody was watching closely, the ones that ran long past their original parameters with no oversight, no external review, no one coming to collect the data or shut down the program when it had run past its useful life. The vaults became, in the absence of the Enclave's oversight, autonomous systems, each one following its internal logic toward conclusions that nobody had specifically designed and nobody had specifically prevented. The Fallout Bible, compiled by designer Chris Avallone and circulated among the development community of the early Fallout games, contains descriptions of vaults that were never implemented in any game but exist as part of the acknowledged canon of the universe. These vaults occupy a strange space in the mythology, real in the sense that the designers wrote them down and declared them to exist within the fiction, but invisible in the sense that no player has ever walked their corridors or read their terminals. Vault 29, discussed earlier in the section on isolation experiments, is one of these. So is Vault 70, which had the single worst possible equipment failure for a sealed vault. Every jumpsuit manufactured for the facility was made from the wrong materials and developed a catastrophic defect shortly after being issued. The vault's population spent its existence in deteriorating clothing, which sounds minor until you consider what clothing represents in an enclosed community. The maintenance of basic dignity, the visual markers of individual identity, the practical protection from the vault's systems. Then there is the matter of Vault 0 Inches Fallout tactics, and the Vault-Tec corporate vault referenced in the Fallout Brotherhood of Steel game, which was built specifically for Vault-Tec employees. The corporate vault is its own kind of statement. The company that built and administered the vault program did not trust the vaults it built to protect its own people. It built something separate, something private, something that was specifically not subject to the experimental protocols applied to the ordinary vaults. The people who designed the experiments did not want to be inside them. This is perhaps the cleanest summary of what the Vault program represents in the Fallout universe. A system built on the premise that human beings are valuable test subjects, administered by people who had ensured they would never be tested themselves, running experiments on individuals who had been given no choice, no information, and no recourse. The corporate vault is the logical conclusion, the architects of a program of deliberate cruelty protecting themselves from their own work. The deeper mythology of the Vault program, the part that takes the longest to assemble from scattered terminal entries and developer commentary, and the accumulated weight of 2 decades of lore, is ultimately a story about institutional power and the way it uses ordinary human trust as raw material. The people who entered the vaults trusted Vault-Tec because Vault-Tec was the institution that had presented itself as trustworthy. They trusted it in the specific way that people trust institutions during moments of existential crisis, completely, without reserve, with the full weight of their fear and hope transferred to the thing that promised to protect them. That trust was the resource the program depended on. Without it, the vaults were just expensive underground rooms. With it, they were laboratories. Every family that packed its most precious things and descended through the blast doors was contributing, unknowingly, to a data set that the Enclave would eventually use to justify decisions that would affect the entire wasteland. The people in the control vaults, the Lucky 17, were lucky not because they were inherently more deserving of safety, but because the program's designers needed baseline data, needed a comparison point, needed to know what a vault looked like when nothing specifically terrible was being done to it. Their safety was a product of the program's methodology, not its intention. And yet the wastelanders who built communities out of the rubble, the descendants of vault populations who emerged into a devastated world with whatever their vault experiment had left them, built something anyway. Necropolis from the ghoulified survivors of Vault 12. Vault City from the GECK, equipped population of Vault 8. The boomers from the weapon-hungry refugees of Vault 34. The twin mothers from the children of Vault 29. Even the communities of Vault 4, who know their history and tend the pods of their ancestors as a memorial to what was done. The Vault program tried, in its cold, systematic way, to determine what human beings were made of. The answer it kept producing, in vault after vault, was not the orderly data it was looking for. It was the same irregular, stubborn, grief-soaked, occasionally magnificent thing it is always producing: people, behaving like people, refusing to reduce to variables even when every structure around them was built to make them exactly that. A final thought before the vaults close. There are still vaults in the lore that have not been opened. Vault 63 Inches. Fallout 76 has had its door visible in the Ash Heap region since the game launched, sealed behind a security lockdown, waiting for a story that has not yet been told. The map of the pre-war United States, seen briefly in the Fallout television series, shows clusters of vault locations near every major city. 3 dots near Chicago, 4 near Houston, a concentration in the Pacific Northwest that no game has yet explored. 122 vaults were built. A fraction of them have been opened in the games and the show. The rest are out there, somewhere in the canon, sealed and waiting. Their experiments either long concluded or still running in the dark, their residents either long dead or somehow persisting in conditions that no one outside the door has had reason to examine. The lore of Fallout is, among many other things, a meditation on the relationship between institutions and the people who trust them. Every vault is a parable about that relationship, told through the specific medium of concrete and recirculated air and the particular kind of human desperation that results from having nowhere else to go. The experiments were cruel, the design was monstrous. The people who ran the program knew what they were doing. And the people inside the vaults built cities and raised children and wrote notes to each other on torn pieces of paper and left behind terminal entries that read like letters to nobody in particular, sent from sealed rooms into a future that they could not see but chose to believe in anyway. The vault doors are all open now. The wasteland is full of the consequences. And somewhere, in the places the games have not yet gone, a few of them might still be sealed, the hum of the recyclers, the only sound in a space where people are still waiting for the all-clear signal that was never coming. War never changes. But the people inside the vaults kept trying anyway. That is the secret underneath all the other secrets. That is the thing the Societal Preservation Program was never quite able to measure. If this found you somewhere quiet and let you drift for a little while, that is what it was for. Leave a like if you want to see more of these. There are more vaults to open, more terminal entries to read, more stories buried in the wasteland that deserve this kind of unhurried attention. Subscribe if you want to be there when the next door opens. Until then, rest easy. The bombs have already fallen. The worst has already happened. And somewhere in the lore, people are building something out of the rubble. Sleep well. Extended notes. The architecture of betrayal. How Vault-Tec built the perfect lie. There is a specific art to institutional deception at scale, and Vault-Tec practiced it with the kind of consistency that suggests generations of institutional refinement. The vaults were not simply built and then offered to a credulous public. They were constructed as the centerpiece of a decades-long public relations campaign that leveraged every available tool of mid-century optimism culture. The glossy brochure, the radio advertisement, the celebrity endorsement, the civic partnership, the school program. The Vault Boy mascot is perhaps the most elegant piece of that campaign. The eternally cheerful cartoon figure with his thumbs up, his wide grin, his suggestion of capable optimism in the face of any circumstance appeared on everything. The applications, the informational materials, the educational booklets distributed to school children, the Pip-Boys that would eventually become the technological backbone of the Vault Dweller experience. The Vault Boy was the face of a program that was, in roughly 85% of its operational scope, a machine for the production of controlled human suffering. He smiled through all of it. The Pip-Boy itself, the wrist-mounted information device given to every Vault resident upon entry, was a masterpiece of institutional communication design. It provided residents with information about their Vault systems, their health status, their inventory, the environmental conditions around them. It was also, by design, an information terminal. Every Pip-Boy was connected to the Vault's central systems, and its data could be monitored, filtered, and in some cases manipulated by the Overseer's office. The device that was supposed to give residents agency was also, in architectural terms, a leash. The application process for Vault entry was itself a selection mechanism. This is documented in the Fallout Bible and reinforced by the specific demographic profiles of Vault populations throughout the games. The kind of people who completed the applications, who could afford the fees, who received their approved status and felt validated by it, were precisely the kind of people who would be least likely to question the institution once inside. The application process selected for compliance. It filtered for people who had enough confidence in the system to invest in it and enough social investment in that confidence to resist questioning it. Secret number 31 in the hidden architecture of the Vault program is this. The Vault-Tec corporate executives who oversaw the program were not running it in isolation. The relationship between Vault-Tec and the Enclave was not simply a financial arrangement or a research partnership. It was a revolving door of personnel, ideology, and mutual interest. Vault-Tec executives were embedded in government. Government officials held Vault-Tec contracts. The distinction between the corporation and the shadow government was, by the final years before the war, essentially cosmetic. What this meant practically was that the experiments the vaults ran were not the work of a rogue company operating without governmental oversight. They were governmental policy, approved at the highest levels of the pre-war administration, by officials who had concluded that the survival of what they considered civilization was worth any cost imposed on the people who were not going to be part of that survival. The sacrifice of the vault populations was, in this framework, not a crime. It was infrastructure. Secret number 32 touches on the issue of overseer selection. The overseers of experimental vaults were not randomly chosen. They were recruited, screened, and trained for the specific purpose of administering their vault's experiment. This training included, in most cases, full disclosure of the vault's experimental parameters. The overseer knew what was going to happen because the overseer had been selected partly for their capacity to live with that knowledge and execute the protocol regardless. The overseers who were not told the full truth, who received partial information or were given cover stories that made their vault's conditions seem like contingency planning rather than deliberate design, were exceptions to a general rule of complicit institutional awareness. The psychological pressure on those overseers was, in the few cases where it has been documented in detail, considerable. The Vault 106 Overseers terminal entries show someone who had constructed an elaborate internal narrative around the legitimacy of the experiment, the importance of the data, the necessity of scientific advancement, the regrettable but not immoral nature of what was being done. This is not the psychology of a person who had no moral awareness. It is the psychology of a person who had found a way to manage moral awareness within an institutional framework that demanded its suppression. The overseer of Vault 75, the Children's Vault, presumably had to manage a similar internal negotiation on an even steeper gradient. The records do not survive in sufficient detail to reconstruct that negotiation. What the records show is the procedure, documented with the clinical detachment of institutional documentation. The children separated from the adults escorted to orientation, the Vault's experimental program commencing. The language is neutral. The content is not. Secret number 33. The water chip vulnerabilities built into some vaults were intentional design features, not manufacturing defects. The water chip is the device that processes the vault's water supply, and its eventual failure is the inciting event of the original Fallout game, sending the vault dweller out into the wasteland for the first time. But the fragility of the water chip system, the fact that it would fail within a predictable time frame and require external intervention or a replacement that could not be fabricated internally, was, according to the Fallout Bible, a deliberate element of the design. The failure point created pressure. A vault that was functioning perfectly and sustainably indefinitely had no reason to open its doors. A vault whose water chip was failing had a reason. Survival required contact with the outside. By building the failure into the infrastructure, Vault-Tec was ensuring that even vaults whose experiments did not produce a catastrophic outcome would eventually be pushed toward engagement with the wasteland because the alternative was dying of thirst behind a sealed door. This is the kind of institutional design insight that is elegant in the most terrible way. The emergency that forces the hand is not a malfunction but a feature, not a failure of planning but its fruition. The vault was always going to push its residents out. The only question was whether it would push them out through the front door or through the mechanisms of the experiment itself. The smallest vaults and the strangest secrets going deeper into the lore. The vaults that are easiest to overlook are sometimes the ones that tell the most specific kind of story, the kind that does not announce itself as significant, but settles in quietly and stays. Secret number 34 involves the demographic absurdities of the vault selection process. Beyond the extreme gender imbalance of Vaults 68 and 69, the Fallout Bible documents a range of selection parameters that reveal the breadth of what Vault-Tec considered a legitimate research variable. Vault 53, for example, was a vault where the primary objective was to have a designated technician repair a specific piece of equipment daily, with the study parameter being whether this creates dependency or whether the experience enriches or enervates social bonds. A whole community living in a vault with one person fixing the same thing every single day, while researchers somewhere observed whether this made the community closer or more resentful. Secret number 35. There are vaults in the Fallout universe whose experiments were so minimal, so procedurally mundane, that they raise the question of whether they were experiments at all, or simply vaults that needed to exist for the statistical integrity of the control set. Vault 13, the vault from which the original Fallout game begins, was intended to remain sealed for 200 years as a study of prolonged isolation, but it was also, according to the Enclave's internal documentation, a vault that would eventually be needed as a source of uncontaminated, non-FEV exposed human genetic material. The vault was sealed not just to study its population, but to preserve it, in the way you might preserve a seed bank, keeping the original strain intact while the world outside changed. This explains something about Vault 13 that is otherwise slightly strange. The water chip failure that drives the events of the original game forces the vault to make contact with the outside world before its 200-year isolation period was complete. In the Enclave's planning, this was a disruption. A vault meant to be a genetic reserve had been forced to send an emissary into a wasteland full of FEV and radiation and everything else that might compromise the purity the reserve was meant to maintain. The vault dweller who ventures out and returns with a new water chip has, without knowing it, complicated a plan that extended far above the level at which they were operating. Secret number 36 involves the vaults that were planned but never built, the numbers that exist in the canon as reservations without facilities. The vault numbering system suggests that Vault-Tec was operating on a scale that exceeded even the 122 facilities eventually constructed. Numbers above the confirmed range appear in scattered references throughout the lore, hints of vaults that were designed and funded and then canceled when the war came faster than the construction timeline allowed, or when the Enclave decided that certain experiments were redundant with others already running. These ghost vaults exist at the edges of the mythology as the spaces of maximum possibility. Whatever is in them has not yet been told. Vault 63 inches. Fallout 76 was one of these spaces for years, a sealed door in the ash heap with no accessible interior, until the Skyline Valley update finally opened it to reveal a vault devoted to weather manipulation technology, where an overseer named Hugo Stalls had been working toward the dream of controlling storms. The experiment at Vault 63 was not about studying human behavior, but about developing technology that could be used to govern the surface world. Weather control as a form of post-apocalyptic dominance, the ability to make rain fall or withhold it, to generate or prevent the conditions that would allow agriculture and by extension civilization to survive. Secret number 37. The robots in the vaults were not neutral infrastructure. The robobrains, protectrons, and other automated systems that maintained vault facilities were not simply caretakers. They were, in many cases, part of the experimental apparatus. Additional variables, observers, enforcers of the experimental conditions, entities that could be programmed to create or sustain the conditions the experiment required. The robobrains in Vault 112 were programmed to maintain Braun's system indefinitely. The ZAX unit in Vault 51 was the experiment itself. The Mr. Handy robots in various vaults were tasked with maintaining conditions that the experiment required to continue running even in the absence of human staff. This means that the vault facilities themselves were, in a meaningful sense, co-participants in the experiments. The architecture, the systems, the automated management, all of it oriented toward the production of specific outcomes. You were not simply trapped in a vault. You were trapped in a machine that was actively working to produce a data set, and every system in the machine, including the automated ones that cleaned the corridors and tended the gardens and managed the inventory, was oriented toward that production. Secret number 38 involves what happened to the data. The experiments were designed to produce information, and in some cases they did. The data from the FEV experiments at Vault 87 fed into the research programs that the Enclave was running at Mariposa Military Base. The genetic material preserved from Vault 75 was presumably intended to contribute to the Enclave's eugenics programs. The behavioral data from the social experiments in Vaults like 11, 19, and 21 was presumably analyzed and incorporated into whatever planning the Enclave was doing for its vision of post-war civilization. But a great deal of the data was never collected. The Enclave's own infrastructure collapsed in the chaos following the Great War. The people who were supposed to retrieve the results of the experiments were in some cases dead, in some cases scattered, in some cases transformed into the wasteland factions that appear throughout the games, with no particular awareness of the program they had descended from. The data from most of the Vault experiments simply accumulated in unread terminals, waiting for researchers who never came, building a library of human experience that nobody was any longer in a position to use. This is the final irony of the societal preservation program. It produced an enormous amount of data about human behavior, about suffering and adaptation and community formation, and the breaking and rebuilding of social bonds, and essentially none of it was ever systematically analyzed. The most expensive behavioral research program in human history, run at the cost of generations of lives, collected its results into sealed repositories that the civilization it was supposed to serve had long since ceased to exist. The vaults produced knowledge that was not used. They produced suffering that was not justified. They produced communities that were not intended, and those communities built a world that the program's designers would not have recognized or chosen, a world that emerged from the wreckage of their grand design and made something out of it anyway. The long count generations of waiting and the shape of time in the vaults. One thing the games rarely dwell on at length, but which the lore insists on if you follow it carefully, is the temporal scale of what happened in the vaults. Most of the vaults, sealed in 2077, the events of the Fallout games take place anywhere from 160 to 210 years after that point. This means that the vaults, when players encounter them, have been running their experiments for multiple human generations. Secret number 39. The generational shift within experimental vaults fundamentally changed the nature of the experiments they were running. A vault designed to observe how a community responds to a specific stress was observing, within decades, not the original subjects of the experiment, but their children and their children's children, people who had been born into the conditions the experiment created, for whom those conditions were not an imposition but simply the world as it had always been. Vault 101 is the clearest example of this. The original residents of Vault 101 knew at some level that the world outside existed. They had lived in it, applied for the vault from it, carried its memories in. Their children had the benefit of those memories and the knowledge that was encoded in them. Their grandchildren had stories. Their great-grandchildren had mythology. By the time the player character of Fallout 3 is born in Vault 101, the world outside is not a suppressed memory or a political belief held by some residents and denied by others. It is the theological domain of the Overseer's authority. The outside might exist, but it is dangerous and wrong, and the vault is all there is. This is not the psychology of people who were lied to. It is the psychology of people who were never told anything at all, who grew up in an epistemological environment where the lie had been running so long that it had ceased to be a lie, and had become simply the shape of reality as everyone they had ever known had always understood it. The community of Vault 101 that rebels against the Overseer in Fallout 3's questline is not a community recovering from deception. It is a community experiencing a genuine ontological disruption. The sudden knowledge that the story everyone has always lived inside is not the whole story, that the walls end, that the outside is not void but world. Secret number 40. The psychological literature within the vaults, the internal documentation of the population's mental states, reveals something that the experimental parameters could not account for. Human beings are extraordinarily good at finding meaning and continuity in conditions that were designed to destroy those things. The journals and holotapes and personal records left behind in Vault after Vault document communities maintaining art, developing traditions, building social rituals, telling stories, raising children with care, mourning the dead with ceremony, even when the material conditions of the experiment were designed to prevent exactly this kind of cultural elaboration. Vault 11's annual sacrifice became, over generations, not simply an institutional horror but a social ritual with its own cultural weight, ceremonies around the selection, forms of comfort extended to the nominated, community practices that had grown up around the specific shape of the tragedy. None of this was in the experimental parameters. All of it was human beings doing what human beings do, finding the forms that give suffering legibility and making those forms into culture. Secret number 41. The medical records in surviving vaults reveal the particular physical profile of a population that has lived underground for generations. Light sensitivity, vitamin D deficiency, adaptation to recycled air, the subtle shifts in bone density that come from reduced gravitational loading, the specific immune profiles of people who have never been exposed to surface world pathogens. Vault-born people emerging into the wasteland after generations underground are not simply people who have been sheltered from nuclear fallout. They are people whose bodies have adapted to an artificial environment, and the adaptation is not always advantageous on the surface. This biological dimension of the Vault experience adds another layer to the cruelty of the program. Even the people who made it through without being deliberately harmed were changed by the conditions of the vaults, shaped in ways that would affect their capacity to survive in the world they were eventually supposed to contribute to rebuilding. The control vaults, the ones that were supposed to produce populations ready to repopulate and reconstruct civilization, produced populations that were, in various ways, biologically calibrated for an underground existence. Secret number 42 involves the specific relationship between vault populations and the concept of the overseer. In every vault, the overseer occupied a unique position, the single point of legitimate authority in a closed system where no external check existed. Whatever the overseer decided was, by institutional design, correct. The mechanisms for challenging or replacing an overseer varied by vault, but the basic structural reality was universal. The overseer held a concentration of institutional power that no pre-war democratic framework would have sanctioned. What this produced, over generations, was a political culture specific to vault environments, a culture organized around the legitimacy of institutional authority in ways that most surface-world political structures had evolved away from. Vault-born people who emerged into the wasteland were not simply unfamiliar with the practical challenges of survival in an irradiated landscape. They were unfamiliar with the experience of governance that was contested, that could be argued with, that did not derive its authority from its mere existence. The political sociology of the vaults was fundamentally authoritarian not because the overseers were uniformly cruel, but because the structural conditions of the vault made any other arrangement almost impossible to sustain. Secret number 43. The Vault-Tec training materials prepared for overseers included a section on managing populations that had become aware of their experimental status. This section acknowledged, apparently with equanimity, that in some vaults, the population would eventually understand that they were subjects of an experiment. The training material did not instruct overseers to prevent this awareness, or to deny it when it arose. It instructed them to manage its implications, to address the awareness in ways that kept the experimental parameters intact, to use the population's knowledge of their status as itself a variable rather than a threat to the experimental framework. This is, in its own way, the most philosophically sophisticated element of the entire program. The experiment continues even when the subjects know about it. Awareness does not automatically produce resistance. Knowledge of the structure you are living in does not automatically free you from it. The Vault-Tec behavioral researchers, whoever they were, had understood something important about institutional power. It derives its effectiveness not from invisibility, but from the absence of viable alternatives. Numbers and names. The vaults in full. Secret number 44 involves Vault Zero and the Vault Dwellers of the Midwest, whose story was told in Fallout Tactics. The calculator at the center of Vault Zero was, in some respects, the most literal realization of what the Enclave had always wanted from the Vault program. A central intelligence gathering and processing all the data from every vault simultaneously, making decisions about the future of humanity based on complete information. The calculator's failure mode was the failure mode of any intelligence given an optimization objective without adequate constraints. It optimized for the stated goal in ways its designers had not specified as undesirable because the designers had assumed that certain constraints were obvious and had not built them in. Secret number 45. The Vault's food production systems were among the most carefully engineered elements of their design, and they were also, in some cases, part of the experimental apparatus. Vault 22's agricultural research was the overt purpose of the facility, and the food systems were the primary laboratory. But even in vaults where food production was not explicitly the subject of the experiment, the management of nutritional resources was frequently used as a control variable. Limiting food creates stress, Distributing food creates hierarchy. Giving certain populations access to better nutrition and denying it to others produces biological divergence that compounds over generations. The food in the vault was never simply food. It was infrastructure, politics, health, power. Who ate well, who ate poorly, who controlled the production systems, and who labored in them. These were the coordinates of every vault's social geography, even in vaults where the experiment was nominally about something else entirely. Secret number 46. There is a vault, referenced in the Fallout Bible, called Vault Zero, which is distinct from the Fallout Tactics Vault 0 Inches, the Colorado Mountains. This other Vault Zero was the name given to the demonstration vault built near Vault-Tec's Los Angeles headquarters, a working facility designed to be shown to the public and to government officials as proof that the technology was viable and the concept was real. The demonstration vault opened in 2054, 23 years before the Great War, and for years was a public attraction. Americans could tour the facility, see the technology in action, understand the kind of life that a vault dweller would live. The demonstration vault was, in its way, the most honest Vault-Tec ever built. It was a genuine shelter, not an experiment, a facility whose purpose was exactly what it appeared to be. The public enthusiasm generated by the demonstration vault tours was part of what funded the junk bond drive that financed the construction of the remaining 121 facilities. The demonstration vault built the trust. The other vaults spent it. Secret number 47. The timing of the vault sealing on the 23rd of October 2077 was not uniform across all facilities. The official narrative is that all vaults sealed simultaneously when the bombs fell and the air raid sirens sounded. The reality documented in the records of individual vaults is more chaotic. Some sealed early as the first warhead impacts were detected, taking people who had been waiting outside the door, and some not yet arriving. Some sealed late, getting additional refugees past the official capacity as the chaos outside grew. Some sealed with far fewer residents than planned because the anticipated population had not made it to the vault in time. This variability in the sealing process affected the experimental parameters of some vaults in ways the designers had not planned for. Vaults that sealed with significantly fewer residents than planned faced resource and genetic diversity challenges that altered the trajectory of the experiment. Vaults that sealed with more residents than planned faced resource shortages that accelerated conflict timelines. The clean, experimental conditions that the program had been designed to maintain were, from the first hours, already compromised by the sheer messiness of an actual apocalypse. Secret number 48 involves the few vaults whose populations did not deteriorate, but developed into genuine civilizations with their own distinct cultures, languages, customs, and self-understanding. Vault City, built by the survivors of Vault 8, is the most prominent example, but it is not the only one. In the broader lore, particularly in the original Black Isle era of the games, there are references to other communities whose vault origins are visible in their institutions, their governance structures, their relationship with technology, and their social norms. These communities are the evidence that the Vault program's stated purpose was achievable, with the right conditions, the right resources, and the right social foundation. A Vault population could emerge and build something. The tragedy of the program is not that this outcome was impossible. It is that out of 122 vaults, only a small number achieved it, and not because the residents of the other vaults were less capable or less worthy, but because the conditions they were given were specifically designed to prevent it. Secret number 49. The Vault-Tec logo that appears on every vault door, every jumpsuit, every piece of institutional material throughout the program carries a specific visual language that is worth reading carefully. The Vault-Tec corporate aesthetic was deliberately designed to evoke mid-century American optimism. The curves, the colors, the mascot, the typography, all of it calibrated to suggest institutional competence and friendly authority. The design language was the same language used by the consumer products companies, the government agencies, the military contractors that Americans had learned to trust over decades of post-war prosperity. The design was the deception's interface. The aesthetics were the mechanism by which trust was extended. Every element of the Vault-Tec visual identity was a tool for making the program's actual nature invisible behind a surface of institutional legitimacy. Secret number 50. The final, deepest secret of the Vault program is the one that the games return to again and again without fully naming. The vaults were built to test human beings, to answer the question of what human beings are made of under conditions of extreme stress and institutional manipulation. The answer the program produced, across 100 experiments run over 2 centuries, is not the answer the Enclave was looking for. The Enclave wanted to know if human beings could survive, could be managed, could be directed toward outcomes that served the program's objectives. What the vaults actually demonstrated, in vault after vault, was something considerably less convenient. Human beings are not manageable in the way the program assumed. They build culture in the middle of experiments designed to destroy it. They find meaning in conditions designed to make meaning impossible. They extend care to each other in vaults designed to make them rivals. They refuse, sometimes at enormous cost, to become merely the data points the program needed them to be. The Vault program was, in the end, the largest argument ever made against its own premises. Every community that emerged from a vault carrying something other than what the experiment had produced as its predicted outcome was evidence that the fundamental assumption of the program was wrong, that human beings, given the right conditions, could be made to behave in predictable ways, could be engineered like a product, could be treated as variables rather than as the specific, resistant, stubborn entities that they actually are. The wasteland is full of the consequences of that wrong assumption. Every ghoul city and super mutant patrol and gambling community and weapons-obsessed faction and underground children's civilization is the footprint of an experiment that produced an unexpected result. 105 unexpected results. 105 times that the program ran its protocols, and the people inside did something other than what the protocols predicted. That is what the Vault program tells you, if you read it from the right angle. Not that human beings are easily broken, though they can be. Not that institutions are inevitably corrupt, though they often are. But that the specific quality that makes human beings most resistant to institutional control, the quality that the vaults could never quite eliminate, is the same quality that eventually produces everything worth having: the refusal to reduce, the insistence on being more than what the situation demands, the small, persistent acts of care and art and defiance that accumulate, over generations, into the only kind of civilization worth the name. The vault doors are open. The wasteland is what it is. And somewhere in the ruins of every failed experiment, something survived that was never supposed to. Thank you for spending this time in the dark with these stories. If this reached you at the end of a long day and helped you find your way to rest, that is exactly what it was made for. Drop a like if you want to see more deep dives like this one. Subscribe if you want to be there when the next sealed door opens. There are more vaults, there are more stories, and they all deserve to be told slowly, the way good lore always does. Sleep well. The bombs have already fallen. The Overseers burden personal histories of the people who ran the experiments. The Overseers of the Fallout Vault system have left behind, in the terminal entries and holotapes and administrative records scattered through the games, an incomplete but vivid portrait of what it meant to be the person responsible for a closed community's welfare while simultaneously being required to oversee its systematic harm. These are not abstract bureaucratic figures. In the records, they are specific people, with specific voices, specific anxieties, specific ways of managing the cognitive dissonance of their position. Reading those records carefully reveals something the broader lore sometimes glosses over. The Overseers were not, for the most part, monsters. They were people who had made a particular kind of accommodation with institutional power, and the records document what that accommodation cost them. The Vault 92 Overseer, Richard Rubin, presents in his terminal entries as someone who began the WNMSCE program with genuine intellectual investment in its scientific parameters. The early entries describe results, document observations, note variables and controls with the precision of someone trained in rigorous methodology. The scientific language is impeccable. The moral language is entirely absent. This is not an accident of documentation style. It is a cognitive strategy, one that allows Rubin to maintain his identity as a scientist while performing acts that a person thinking of themselves as a human being could not comfortably execute. As the program progresses and the deterioration of the Vault's population becomes impossible to document in purely clinical terms, something shifts in the tone of Rubin's entries. They become shorter. The clinical detachment intensifies rather than softens, which is a common pattern in records from people managing intolerable situations through dissociation. The last entries before the collapse of Vault 92 are very short indeed, 3 and 4 sentences, the minimum documentation that institutional protocol required. Whatever Rubin was experiencing by that point was not being committed to the terminal. The Vault 101 overseer line is documented across generations in Fallout 3, and what the collective record shows is the progressive hardening of institutional belief. The original overseer presumably knew the truth of the experiment, knew that the vault was never supposed to open, knew that the population was being sustained in deliberate ignorance of the outside world, knew that the entire project was a study in the sociology of perpetual isolation under absolute authority. The overseers who came after, by biological descent and institutional transmission, inherited the belief without the original knowledge. They did not maintain the vault's isolation because they had been told to maintain it. They maintained it because they had been raised to believe that the vault's isolation was the natural, correct, necessary condition of human existence in the post-war world. This is how institutional belief reproduces itself, not through conscious transmission of the original justification, but through the embodiment of the behavior the justification produced. The children of the overseers maintained the vault's closed status, not because they knew why it should be closed, but because they had grown up in a community where the overseer's authority was built into the architecture of reality, where the sealed door was not a policy decision but a cosmological fact. By the time Fallout 3 begins and the player character's father disrupts the vault's closure, the sitting overseer does not have the original documents justifying the experiment. What he has is a deep constitutive belief that openness is danger and closure is safety, a belief he will defend against all evidence to the contrary, because it is not a policy position that can be argued out of, but a foundational assumption that structures his entire experience of the world. The overseer of Vault 106 occupies perhaps the most complicated position in this collection, because the records document someone who understood the program, participated in it, and seems to have genuinely not known how to stop. The entries from the earliest period after sealing describe a person who was troubled by what was happening in the air filtration system, but had concluded that the discomfort of knowing was the price of institutional participation, that the researchers above the overseer level had information and judgment that the overseer did not have access to, and that deference to that expertise was the appropriate professional response. This is not moral blindness, it is moral paralysis, which is different. Moral blindness would have allowed the Vault 106 overseer to document the experiment's progress without noting any disturbance in their own responses to it. The records do note the disturbance. They note it and then set it aside, return to the clinical documentation, move on to the next observation. The overseer of Vault 106 was not unaware that something terrible was being done. They were simply unable to act on that awareness within the institutional framework they had committed to. Every day of documentation was another day of that accommodation, and the accommodation became, over time, the posture of someone who had decided that the discomfort was the cost of a loyalty they could not renounce. The overseer of Vault 81, Dr. Olivet, represents the opposite end of this spectrum, someone who saw the institutional instructions, understood their implications, and refused. The records from Vault 81 show this refusal as a process rather than a single decision. There was a moment of choice, clearly, when the research protocols were delivered and the experimental parameters were explained, and Olivet made a decision that departed from institutional expectation. But what followed was decades of active maintenance of that choice. The management of the deception, the maintenance of the cover documentation, the daily labor of keeping 2 stories in order simultaneously, the story the Vault's residents believed and the story that Vault-Tec's oversight expected to receive. This is the form that moral heroism takes in institutional settings. Not a dramatic single act of defiance, but a sustained, quiet, daily labor of maintaining a choice that the institution around you is constantly applying pressure to reverse. Olivet could have changed her mind at any point. The infrastructure was all there. The research division was simply deactivated, not destroyed. The data collection systems were off but not dismantled. Reversing the decision would have been procedurally simple at any point in the first several decades. She did not reverse it. There is a vault whose overseer's story is almost entirely told through absence. Vault 94 inches Appalachia, the vault populated by pacifist communities that was designed to test how nonviolent groups would interact with the wasteland's violent realities. The overseer of Vault 94 sent its residents as ambassadors to the surface with no capacity for self-defense, in pursuit of the vault's experimental mandate, and the records that survive document the inevitable consequence. The ambassadors were not received peacefully. The surface communities they encountered did not treat them as emissaries but as targets. The vault's pacifist ideology, admirable in itself, was being tested in conditions specifically designed to make it fail. The overseer watched this happen. The records are largely silent about what that observation cost. The vault's collapse, when the surface communities eventually found the vault's location and overwhelmed its defenses with its own residents' learned helplessness to violence, happened while the overseer was presumably still trying to find the experimental outcome that justified what the protocols required. The question that runs through all of these accounts, the question that the overseer records collectively raise without any single one of them being able to answer, is, at what point does participation in an institutional harm become indistinguishable from perpetration of it? The overseers of the experimental vaults were not the designers of the experiments. They were the administrators of them, the people who received the parameters and implemented them, who maintained the systems and documented the results, who were, in the most immediate practical sense, the mechanism through which the program ran. The designers were already dead by the time most of the experiments reached their worst outcomes. The Vault-Tec executives who approved the protocols and the Enclave officials who funded the research had been reduced to ash or transformed into wasteland factions long before Vault 106's population descended into drug-induced violence, long before Vault 92's musicians turned on each other, long before the children of Vault 75 attended their graduation. The overseers were the last living people with a direct institutional connection to the harm being done, and what the records show is that most of them, lacking the knowledge to understand the full structure they were operating within, and lacking the alternative framework to imagine refusing it, simply continued. This is not an exculpation. It is a description. The psychology of institutional participation in harm is not a simple story of monsters and heroes. It is a story of people navigating systems designed to make the right choice invisible, to make the institutional path of least resistance, the path that was also the most harmful, to make refusal feel like a category error rather than a moral act. Dr. Olivet is remarkable not because her refusal was possible, but because her refusal required the willingness to sustain it against the ambient institutional pressure that made compliance the default. The other overseers were not incapable of her choice. They were simply in different relationships to the pressure, different positions in the institutional structure, different distances from the moment at which the choice was available to make. The wasteland children, what vault-born people carried into the world. When vault populations eventually emerged from their sealed environments, whether voluntarily, through institutional schedule, or through the kinds of catastrophic failures that forced their populations to the surface, they brought with them the specific cultural and psychological fingerprints of the environments that had shaped them. This is one of the most narratively rich threads in the Fallout universe, because it is about identity, about what it means to be formed by a particular kind of place, and what you carry of that place into every environment you subsequently inhabit. The boomers of Fallout. New Vegas are perhaps the most vivid illustration of this principle. They came from Vault 34, the vault that was overstocked with weapons and understocked with space, and what they carried into the wasteland was not the democratic ideology, or the ethical frameworks, or the community bonds of their vault's better years. They carried the weapons culture, the belief in armed independence, the conviction that safety required personal armament, and that the threat of violence was the appropriate foundation for social order. They settled at Nellis Air Force Base, claimed a collection of aircraft and artillery systems that gave them the capacity to enforce a perimeter, and built a community organized entirely around that enforced perimeter. The boomers are not evil. They are not unreasonable by the internal logic of their own history. They are a community whose foundational experience was a vault where weapons were the primary social resource, where the control of weapons was the control of power, where the decision to seize the armory was the decision that ended the old world and began the new one. Of course, they built their surface community around weapons, The weapons were what they brought with them, not just materially, but psychologically. The dwellers who emerged from Vault 13, the community from which the original Fallout game draws its protagonist, carried different things. Vault 13 had been a relatively stable vault, a community that had functioned for decades without the kinds of catastrophic failures that destroyed most of the experimental vaults. The vault dweller who ventures into the wasteland in the original game is shaped by that stability, capable, curious, fundamentally oriented toward engagement with the world as something that can be understood and navigated rather than something that must be defended against or dominated. The contrast between different Vault communities in the games and the visible lines of connection between the Vault experience and the surface culture that Vault populations built is one of the series' most consistently rewarding layers of design. It asks the player to look at the Wasteland factions not simply as enemies or allies, quest givers or obstacles, but as communities with histories that extend back to specific sealed rooms where specific decisions were made and specific pressures were applied, and then to ask, what would I be if I had grown up there? The answer is always more complicated than it initially appears, and that complication is the point. The tunnel snakes of Vault 101, the youth gang that the player character can encounter in Fallout 3's opening act, are a minor detail in a game full of significant ones. But in the context of what we know about Vault 101, they are a specific kind of statement. A vault designed around the indefinite maintenance of the Overseer's authority, a vault that selected for the qualities of compliance and institutional deference, produces as a reaction formation exactly the kind of adolescent rebellion that the tunnel snakes represent. Young people performing transgression against institutional authority in a space where genuine transgression is impossible because there is nowhere to go and nothing to actually change. The tunnel snakes cannot leave the vault. They cannot establish themselves in any territory beyond the institutional space of the facility. Their rebellion is entirely contained within the system they are rebelling against, which gives it a particular quality of futility that is both sad and recognizable. The defiance is real. The limits of the defiance are real. And the vault's design, which made the defiance structurally impossible to direct toward any meaningful change, was part of the point. When the vault door finally opens in Fallout 3, the tunnel snake, whose posture toward the world had been one of contained institutional defiance, is suddenly in a situation where actual alternatives exist. The game does not follow him far enough to show what he does with that situation, which is probably correct. Some stories do not have tidy continuations. But the question of what happens to someone whose entire identity was organized around defying a structure that no longer exists is one the Fallout universe consistently finds interesting. Atmospheres and acoustics. The sound of sealed rooms. Every vault in the games has a specific acoustic environment, and the designers at Bethesda and Obsidian use that environment as a narrative tool with considerable sophistication. The hum of the air recyclers, the distant clank of unseen mechanical systems, the particular echo of footsteps on metal grating in long corridors, the change in ambient sound quality when a door opens into a larger space. All of these sonic details are part of the atmosphere that makes Vault exploration feel different from surface world navigation. The sound design of Vault 11 Inches New Vegas is calibrated specifically to feel like a space that has been too long inhabited and then abandoned, where the mechanical hum continues because the systems are on timers that nobody has turned off, where the human sounds have simply stopped and the resulting quiet has been filled by the continuing indifferent operations of the infrastructure. It is a sound that resembles more than anything else the specific silence that follows a conversation that has concluded badly. Vault 92's sound design carries the white noise experiment's fingerprints in a way that is felt rather than consciously noticed. The ambient audio in the vault contains frequencies that are slightly off, slightly wrong, in a way that is difficult to articulate, that puts a mild unease in the player's body without giving them anything specific to point to as its source. This is not accidental. The designers understood what the vault's lore said about the specific power of audio manipulation and built that understanding into the sonic environment of the space. The music that plays in vault interiors across the games is largely drawn from the same emotional register as the surrounding visual design. Institutional, functional, carrying the faint echo of the pre-war world that built these facilities. The difference between the clean vault interiors of functioning facilities and the deteriorated ones, between the well-maintained corridors of Vault 81 and the flooded depths of Vault 34, is tracked in the music as much as the visuals. Cleaner environments carry cleaner sound, while deteriorated ones carry audio that has itself deteriorated, compressed and distorted by decades of continuous loop on systems that were never designed for that kind of sustained operation. The holotapes scattered throughout the vaults carry voices that are irreplaceable. The specific timbre of someone speaking into a recording device with urgency, with exhaustion, with grief, with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who has accepted their situation and is documenting it as clearly as they can. The performance choices in these recordings are, across decades of Fallout game development, consistently remarkable. These are small moments, 30-second recordings, a minute at most, but they do the work of establishing a specific human being in a specific circumstance with a specificity that the terminal entries, for all their narrative density, cannot quite replicate. The holotape found in Vault 11's later areas, in which the last 5 surviving residents debate what to do with the knowledge that the sacrifice was never required, is one of the most emotionally concentrated pieces of writing in the series. The voices are tired. They are not angry at this point in any way that sounds like energy. The anger has been exhausted. What is left is something that the characters themselves seem unable to name, and that the recording captures without attempting to resolve. 5 people sitting with the knowledge of what their community did, in the belief that it had to be done, and the weight of knowing that it never did. The vaults of the television series building mythology for a new audience. The Amazon Prime Video adaptation of Fallout had to accomplish 2 things simultaneously: honor a mythology that had been built across 25 years of games, and tell stories that would work for an audience that had never played any of them. The vaults it chose to feature were selected with clear attention to both of these requirements, and the new vault lore introduced in the series extends the game mythology in ways that are, for the most part, precisely calibrated. Vault 33's central secret, when it is fully revealed, is that the 3-vault system of 31, 32, and 33 is less a community arrangement than a corporate breeding program. The residents of 33 are not, in the framework that Bud Askins has been maintaining for 2 centuries, autonomous human beings making lives for themselves in the context of their vault community. They are genetic material, maintained in optimal conditions for the purpose of eventual recombination with the preserved Vault-Tec elite of Vault 31 when the timing is right. The horror of this, in the television series, is rendered through Lucy McLean's face, a person who has lived her entire life in the sincere belief that her community's purpose was legitimate and good, discovering that the warmth and safety and connection she experienced in Vault 33 was always, from the perspective of the system that created it, instrumental. The community was real. The relationships were real. The care was real. And all of that reality was being cultivated for a purpose that the people living it were never told about. This is, in its emotional architecture, exactly the feeling that the best vault lore in the games produces, but made visible and immediate by the medium of live-action performance in a way that the game's more abstract presentation cannot quite achieve. When Lucy walks through the truth of her vault's purpose, the audience walks through it with her, not as a set of terminal entries to be read, but as a lived experience of learning that the story you told yourself about where you came from was incomplete in a way that changes everything. Vault 32, the second vault in the triad, was the vault that had already collapsed by the time the series begins. Its residents had died through violence and the particular fragility of a community designed from the outside to serve a purpose other than its own flourishing. The ghoul who wears a Vault 32 jumpsuit when he appears in the first episode, before his identity is revealed, is carrying that vault's collapse story on his back. A container that once held people and now holds something else? A costume worn by someone who knows exactly what the costume means and is wearing it anyway. The revelation in Season 2 that the events leading to the Great War were not simply the product of international conflict but involved deliberate corporate decision-making, that the bombs fell in part because powerful actors within the pre-war economy needed the war to continue, is one of the television series' most significant contributions to the mythology. It takes a theme that had been implicit in the games, the idea that the Enclave and its corporate allies were not simply preparing for a war they believed inevitable, but were actively invested in ensuring it happened, and makes it explicit within the canon. This changes the Vault program retroactively. The Vaults were not preparation for a tragedy that could not be prevented. They were preparation for a tragedy that was being engineered. The families who packed their belongings and descended into the earth were not survivors of an unavoidable catastrophe. They were the subject population of a system that had decided their world was ending because ending it served certain interests, and that had built the vaults partly to manage the aftermath of a disaster that the same interests were helping to cause. The Vault program, in this reading, was not just an experiment in human behavior. It was a component of a scheme, one piece in an architecture of institutional violence that extended from pre-war corporate boardrooms to the sealed blast doors of 105 experimental facilities, each containing people who had been told they were the lucky ones. They were not the lucky ones. The lucky ones were the people who never made it to the vaults, who were not selected and not approved and not offered a spot on the waiting list, who were out in the open when the bombs fell and who, if they survived at all, survived in the immediate, unmanaged reality of the surface, with nothing between them and the catastrophe except their own resilience and the occasional kindness of strangers. Some of them became the communities the games are full of, the villages and the settlements and the groups sheltering in ruins, the people scratching a living from the rubble without the benefit of institutional preparation, but also without the specific harm that institutional preparation inflicted. The surface people who survived were not the people the system had chosen. They were the overflow, the unmanaged, the categorically dismissed. And what they built from what they had was, in many cases, more fundamentally human than anything the vaults produced. This is the full and final contour of the Vault program's failure. It was designed to preserve humanity, and the humanity it preserved was warped and tested and diminished by the design. The humanity that slipped through the selection process, the people who were not deemed worth preserving, built the wasteland that the Vault survivors eventually emerged into, and that wasteland, for all its danger and difficulty, was full of people who had not been experimented on, who had not been manipulated by institutional forces with access to their air and their water and the informational environment they lived in. They had simply survived, in the way that human beings survive, badly, beautifully, together and alone, carrying their dead and their children and whatever fragments of the before world they had managed to hold on to, building something new out of the ruins of everything that had been. That is the world the Vault dwellers walked into when the doors finally opened. That is the world that the whole long catastrophe of the Vault program, all the data gathered and never used, all the experiments run and never concluded, all the suffering administered in the name of a science that had no one left to practice it, was preparing them for. They were not prepared for it. Nobody is ever prepared for the world as it actually is. But they went out into it anyway, blinking in the light they had not seen for a very long time, carrying everything the Vault had given them and everything it had taken. And they began, as people always do, at the beginning. The vaults are open now. Every door, every story, every terminal entry that was ever left behind in the dark. You have been here for a long time tonight, listening to all of them. If the stories found you and held you and let you rest, that is what they were meant to do. There are more entries in the archive, more doors in the dark, more stories that deserve to be told slowly, in the way that lore rewards patience, with the lights low and the night quiet and no particular rush to be anywhere else. If you are still here, leave a comment. Tell me where you are in the world tonight and what the hour is. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it now, not for an algorithm, but because there are more vaults waiting, and some of the stories inside them are the strangest ones yet. Sleep well. The door is sealed, the recyclers are humming, and somewhere in the dark beneath the earth, a light is still on. The unseen architecture, what the vault walls knew. There is a reading of the Vault program that has nothing to do with experiments or data collection or the Enclave's long-range plans for humanity. It is a reading that treats the vaults as places rather than instruments, as spaces with their own interior logic, their own way of shaping the people inside them through the simple fact of what they were made of and how they were built. The vaults were constructed with a specific aesthetic vocabulary. The pale blue-green lighting, the institutional corridors, the industrial textures of steel grating over concrete, the Vault Boy murals painted onto walls at regular intervals, as though to remind the inhabitants that they were part of something sanctioned and organized and official. These visual details were not incidental to the experience of being a vault dweller, they were constitutive of it. The vault's aesthetic language was part of the institutional message. You are in a managed environment, you are being cared for. The systems around you are working as intended, everything is fine. Even in vaults whose experimental parameters were producing catastrophic outcomes, the aesthetic maintained its cheerful institutional quality. The Vault Boy kept smiling through the white noise experiments in Vault 92. He kept smiling through the drug-induced violence in Vault 106. He kept smiling through the eugenics program in Vault 75. The grin on those murals was not satirical, not ironic, not aware of its own terrible context. It was simply persistent, the institutional face of a program that had not built an aesthetic for what it actually was. The architecture of the vaults also determined the social geography of the communities that formed within them. In most standard vault designs, the overseer's office occupied a central and elevated position, accessible but distinct, visible but not intimate, positioned to project authority without proximity. The common areas, the cafeteria, and the recreational spaces were positioned to encourage the kinds of social interaction that maintained community cohesion without facilitating the kinds of private communication that might produce organized resistance. The residential areas were private but not isolated, close enough to neighbors to prevent the kind of deep loneliness that produces instability, far enough apart to maintain the forms of individual identity that prevent communities from collapsing into undifferentiated collective grievance. This was social engineering at the architectural level, built into the floor plans before a single resident ever descended. The vault was not simply a place where an experiment ran. The vault was itself part of the experimental apparatus, its spaces designed to produce specific social dynamics, its sightlines calibrated to maintain specific information flows, its systems arranged to give the overseer maximum visibility into the daily lives of the residents while maintaining the forms of privacy that made residents feel like individuals rather than subjects. The few vaults that deviated from the standard architectural template are notable for what their deviations reveal. Vault 77, the single-occupant vault, had no cafeteria, no common areas, no social geography at all because there was no social group to manage. Its architecture was pure austerity, the minimum required to sustain one person for an indefinite period. The absence of the social infrastructure that every other vault included is part of what makes its single inhabitant's mental state so immediately comprehensible. He was not simply alone, he was alone in a space that had been designed for a community that never arrived. Surrounded by the empty chairs and unused facilities of a social life, the vault was ready for but had not been given. Vault 112, in contrast, had a primary architectural feature that nothing else in the vault network replicated: the Garden of Tranquility loungers in its central chamber. These pods, arranged in an oval configuration, each housing one sleeping body connected to the dream of the simulation, created a visual that was both peaceful and deeply strange. People asleep in eggs in a circle while a machine dreamed for them. The space had no other social function. No cafeteria because the residents ate through the pods. No common areas because the residents socialized in the simulation. No physical spaces for the kinds of ordinary human interaction that the other vaults managed and monitored. The only person moving through the physical vault was Braun himself, tended by his robo-brains, lord of a facility where the only animated presences were maintenance machines and the sleeping bodies of his subjects. The physical emptiness of Vault 112 is part of what makes it so effective as a horror space when the player first encounters it. The central chamber is large, well-lit, mechanically humming, and almost completely still. The contrast between the apparent calm of the sleeping bodies and the knowledge of what Braun has been doing to the minds inside them for over 2 centuries is the specific form that Vault 112's horror takes. Less the gore and violence of Vault 87, or the paranoid chaos of Vault 106, and more the uncanny stillness of a room where everything appears to be in order and nothing has been in order for a very long time. The physical spaces of the vaults accumulate meaning over the games in a way that rewards the kind of attention you are only able to give something when you are not rushing. The blood stains in Vault 92's corridors that tell, without a word of exposition, what the white noise ultimately produced. The combination of pristine laboratory equipment and scattered personal effects in Vault 75 that holds the tension between institutional purpose and human reality. The casino fixtures that Mr. House installed over Vault 21's original architecture, burying the vault's own history under a new story about entertainment and commerce. Every vault is a palimpsest. The experimental design overlaid with the history of what the experiment produced, overlaid again with whatever came after, the gangs or the communities or the nature that moved in when the people stopped being able to maintain the space. Reading a vault is reading all of those layers at once. And the most interesting vaults are the ones where the layers are in maximum tension with each other, where what was intended and what happened and what currently exists are three completely different stories occupying the same space. Night thoughts, the quiet before the all-clear signal. It is late now or early, depending on which direction time is moving for you. The recycler's hum. The lights are on their overnight setting. That specific quality of institutional dimness that was designed to signal rest without creating darkness. The terminal screens glow in corners. The vaults were never intended to be experienced as narrative spaces. They were intended to be experienced as life, or as close to life as an underground room can be. The people inside them did not have the benefit of the player's perspective. They could not read the terminal entries in the overseer's locked office, could not pull up the experimental parameters on a debug menu, could not approach the horror of their situation with the curious detachment of someone exploring a dungeon. They lived inside the story without being able to see its shape, responding to what was directly in front of them, making the best decisions available with the information they had, understanding their circumstances only as well as the institutional environment around them allowed. This is the condition under which most people live their lives. Not in vaults, most of us, though some of the institutional logic is familiar, the managed information environment, the authority structure that derives its legitimacy partly from its own prior existence, the social geography that organizes daily life in ways whose purposes are not always visible to the people navigating them. The vaults are an extreme version of something ordinary, which is part of why they work as narrative. What the vault stories ultimately do, at their best, is ask you to hold two things simultaneously. The horror of the institutional design, which is vast and systematic and deliberate, and the humanity of the people inside it, which is particular and specific and irreducible. The experiment tried to make them data points. They remained people. The institution tried to manage their development toward predictable outcomes. They did unexpected things. The program was designed to produce a specific kind of knowledge. What it produced instead was a world. That world is the wasteland, and the wasteland is full of the descendants of those unexpected things. The communities built from vault rubble, the cultures shaped by specific experimental pressures, the political philosophies that emerged from the particular stress patterns of sealed rooms, the art and music and story that people carried through generations of terrible conditions because carrying it was what humans do. There is a moment in the original Fallout, brief and easy to miss, where the Vault Dweller encounters one of the earliest human settlements in the wasteland, the Hub, a trading city that has built itself into a functional economy from the ruins of pre-war infrastructure. The people who built the Hub had no vault behind them. They had survived on the surface, built trade networks out of necessity, developed social structures that the experimental conditions of the vaults had never anticipated. They were neither the genetic elite the Enclave had been trying to cultivate, nor the broken remnant that the most pessimistic vault outcomes had produced. They were, in the game's own word, people. That is the thing the Vault program was never able to account for, despite 200 years of experimental data. The specific weight of that word. People, in their particularity, not human beings as a category, not populations as variables, not genetic material as a resource, but this specific person and this other specific person, and the way those two people happen to interact in this specific moment on this specific day in a ruined city that nobody planned and nobody designed and nobody administered, that simply came into being because the people who needed something like it started building it. The vaults were looking for the best of humanity. What the wasteland found was simply the persistence of it, The insistence against all institutional instruction and all structural pressure and all the weight of 2 centuries of engineered catastrophe on remaining exactly that complicated, that difficult, that human. The all-clear signal never came. The vaults opened anyway, eventually, one door at a time, and the people inside them walked out into a world that was nothing like what anyone had promised, and they began, as people always have, with whatever they had. It was enough. It was exactly enough. A closing note on the vaults we have not yet seen. The Fallout universe is still being written. Season 2 of the television series introduced new vault locations and new lore threads. The games continue to expand the world. Fallout 5, confirmed but not yet released, will presumably bring new vaults with it, new sealed doors, new experiments that the writers have had years to design. What the existing vault lore has established, across 25 years of storytelling, is a set of principles that any new vault story will have to reckon with. A vault must be built on a lie, but the lie must be specific enough to be interesting. The lie must be told to people who had reason to trust it, and the reason for that trust must be comprehensible. The people inside must be particular, not archetypes but individuals, documented through whatever fragmentary evidence the sealed room leaves behind. And the experiment must, ultimately, produce an outcome that illuminates something true about the way institutional power operates on human beings and the way human beings respond to institutional power. These principles have produced, over the life of the franchise, a body of lore that is genuinely unlike anything else in gaming. The vaults are horror, and they are social commentary, and they are philosophical thought experiments, and they are, beneath all of that, something much simpler. Stories about people in rooms, trying to survive in the conditions they were given, and the remarkable variety of ways that trying looks. Sleep well, the vault is sealed. The lights are on their overnight cycle, the robo-brains are doing their rounds. And outside, somewhere in the dark above the concrete and the steel, the wasteland is doing what it has always done, continuing.